Oh, people. Coming in hot today. Not with the music, obviously. The music today is a little more reflective in more way than one, but I'm coming in hot on the mic. No barrier between myself and the microphone. Usually I have this nice foam cover on it, and it keeps things a little bit cleaner when it comes to the execution like this, but also takes, some edge off in a good way, and also it stops the certain consonants from popping a little hard. But I wanted to be close to the mic today. I wanted to get in. I wanted to get right in there. So I'm feeling a little more confrontational with this one because I just watched 2 Janis Joplin related movies in the last 2 days, and oh, have I got thoughts to share with you. I will be going into Down on Us, which came out in 1984 and then was re-released as Beyond the Doors in 1989, and the much lauded, for many good reasons, film The Rose, starring Bette Midler. And some people technically would say that is not a Janis Joplin film, and they would be wrong. It was originally a screenplay titled Pearl, which is the name of Janis Joplin's final album before she died and one of her nicknames. But the filmmakers really didn't want to commit to doing just a Janis Joplin bio. And I can professionally understand, I can see from a professional standpoint on their part, not mine, not saying I'm a professional in any way, definitely not in their arena or their industry, how that would be a little too much weight for them to bear, a little too much restriction when it comes to how to tell the story they want to tell. So it became a conglomerate of Janice and 2 other people, and that gave them more creative license to do what they wanted. And I think it gave them more freedom to really make it more of a showpiece for Bette Midler, a real breakout kind of performance piece for her. And hats off to Bette damn Midler. Holy smokes. Woo! I went in this movie not wanting to like it, I'll tell you that. And boy, did she win me over. And I've never seen Bette Midler in hardly anything. I mean, when I was a teenager, I babysat some kids who watched Hocus Pocus when it was on VHS for the first time. I remember that. And I know I saw most of or half the movie For the Boys, which came out in the mid-90s, I believe, and she was a great performer in that. I at least got it. But for my own bias and for my own context, I have to preface my evaluation of Bette Midler's place in the entertainment universe by saying I am not her demographic whatsoever. I am. But by the time I became aware of her, she was sort of seen as someone who was going to kind of spend her career doing movies like Beaches, like really sentimental movies for ladies. I'll just say it that way. Although she had done stuff like Ruthless People with Danny DeVito, and she got to be like mean in that and crazy in that, and Outrageous Fortune. I know I think I saw Outrageous Fortune on video, at least most of it. And she was like wild and kind of raunchy and fun and stuff. I don't know. But I was not her target audience. She didn't, normally she didn't like captivate me. But then again, I was a very young person. I wanted to watch the Star Wars and Batman, for crying out loud. But anyone who loves music and loves entertainment and loves acting can watch a person do an amazing job at something and really want to get behind it and share it with other people. And that's kind of how I feel about her performance in this film, for sure. While I have problems with other elements of the film, some of this film makes me really, really mad. But let's start instead, before we get into the Rose, let's start with Down on Us from 1984. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this episode about anything except for the Janis Joplin specific parts of the film. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to the film itself and the filmmakers and their approach to how they how they portray these three musicians, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, all at the same time, in the same timeline. And well, let's say I'll get deep into that and give that element of the picture, the whole production of that, its due. When we get into the Jimi Hendrix elements of that film and the Jim Morrison elements of that film, the Doors episode is going to be long. If it's not 3 episodes on its own, because we're not gonna dwell too much on the Oliver Stone film. I think it speaks for itself. I have gripes with it. I have a lot of stuff to talk about when it comes to its inaccuracies, which is basically 80% of the film. So if you want that, stay tuned. It's coming your way pretty soon. I've been binging on a lot of movies and taking a lot of notes lately. So even now I'm off track. I'm supposed to be doing Chuck Berry and wrapping up more Jerry Lee Lewis, but I just got so fired up on this 2 in a row of Janice. I wanted to go straight to my notes and just use this energy right now. So let's see. Let me go to my notes for Down on Us. And there's not a lot for Janice. So I'm going to just tear through those pretty quickly from the document that I was typing on while I was watching the film for the very first time. Janice shows up, super non-Texan sounding, meaning her voice sounds non-Texan, even though they mention her being Texan twice in 10 minutes. But clearly, the woman portraying her is a very good singer. Feels like someone you would see open for Melissa Etheridge or Bonnie Raitt, both of whom I like, in the late 80s maybe. Wow, super non-accurate guitar on her sideman, like a Les Paul ripoff with a pointy headstock and zebra pickups. That note is just for the guitar players out there. Not relevant to anybody else. Not relevant to the other people who wouldn't notice it, which is who most movies are made for. 49 minutes in, the news reporter's words make Janice tie off and shoot up, while Jimmy then plays the national anthem. Janice had just sang a song that sounded more like Ann Wilson of Heart, and a lot of the same vocal moves from Straight On to You. Later on, I wrote, Janice in this film is a sad sack who can't get laid and complains about it. Also, she constantly talks about herself and her problems, sometimes in third person. She has no solid identity, and she's flailing and constantly complaining about being alone. She has no hangers-on or friends trying to get a piece of the action at all? Come on now. Later still, I wrote, Janice is seen wearing lots of frumpy, cover-you-up clothes like draperies. Nothing revealing or tight. The guys in the studio mentioned she's getting married on Sunday. I'm going to have to get deeper into her actual biography for that to verify whether that was a thing. Because between us, I am farther behind on the text than I am with the films in this case. And it's a balance I'm going through depending on how many books have shown up in my mailbox that I've ordered recently versus how many films I can track down streaming or on YouTube or via library services. In this case, I've read most of Scars of Sweet Paradise the author's last name is Eccles, and it's a great book. But when I say I've read, I read most of it. I've read most of it from the beginning and most of it towards the end. I haven't gotten through the middle part yet. So I will get back to you on whether she was about to get married the week that she died. I somehow don't think so, but I could be wrong. Look for a correction later in this episode, perhaps. The fellas in the recording studio, like behind the glass, behind the mixing desk, they keep using kind of suspect language as far as production jargon. They keep saying like, this is just a mix track. I don't know what just a mix track is. They're probably trying to convey this is a scratch track, or that she's singing to scratch tracks, which is something that, like, you run through the song to get a good tone and a good sound, but really you're only keeping certain instruments' final takes. Usually you're keeping all the drums, and then you can kind of refine the performances of the guitars or the keyboards or bass or whatever later. But when vocalists come in, sometimes they're playing and singing with the band. They're doing scratch tracks. They're going to redo them later. They're going to erase them and redo them later for more perfection. In this case, I think what they're trying to say is she's singing a final vocal because the rest of the band's not done with their stuff yet, and she's singing over scratch tracks. But they call it a mixed track. It's just a mixed track. I don't know. They mention that she's never been happier that they've ever seen her. But the producer goes, but I like her better blue. As they go into a song called Easy Now. Again, to my ears, this sounds like 80s soft rock radio fluff, or maybe bluesy 70s country that ironically would never be, what did I write? Ironically never be on record, but would be, would never be released on someone's album, but would be in the background of a crappy 70s movie about a roadhouse or something, like a prequel to the movie Roadhouse. She's tracking, I wrote this in all caps. She's tracking while wearing 2 tablecloths worth of fabric and doilies in a super anti-60s gated snare drum sound. Also, again, the looping. The audio of the actress or singer not doing great, as far as the portrayal of the person visually doing stuff. Not matching up well. But with her 80s hairdo, she seems like someone whose band headlined a lot of classic rock festivals at racetracks. Car racetracks, horse racetracks, or motorcycle racetracks. I wrote, then back to our raincoat / FBI guy with a very sensitive mic on his jacket, so sounds of him putting something in his pocket is insanely loud. Right after he injects something into Janice's oranges. Now, this is a scene later that happens after the recording session where she's in an apartment or something, or a hotel room, and she's got a big fruit bowl full of oranges and one of the old-timey-ish juicer sort of mechanisms. Not the kind where you chop something up and you throw it in a machine and it just liquefies everything automatically, like these food blender processor things. This was like this at least the 70s and probably earlier. I'm sure someone's going to correct me, or no one's going to correct me. No one listening to this is just going to get pissed off about orange juicing, but enough to call in and stop me here or email me. But, the way people used to juice oranges and grapefruits and lemons and such, there was a dish with a little mountain in the middle of it, and you would mash half of an orange or grapefruit on top of it and twist it and twirl it till all the juices came out, and you collect them in the bottom of that dish, and you throw away the rind. Why is this important, you ask? Well, I think it's actually a nice detail. Whether or not they meant it to be this sort of smart or revealing or whatever, the fact that she's in a little bungalow-type apartment by herself, juicing her own oranges to make her vodka and orange juices, is very telling. It's another example in this film of what a sad sack they're portraying her as. There's no one there to get her an orange juice. She can't just keep a jug of orange. Well, maybe, I don't guess people like juicing fresh oranges. It tastes better. But, she's alone doing drugs and making her own orange juice and vodka or whatever. It's either intentionally portraying her as extra pathetic compared to Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, or it's just it's something they didn't think about because they didn't want to hire more actors to be hangers-on, I guess. And I don't think there's a lot of that, quite frankly. There's a lot of, there's a couple of party scenes. There's plenty of music scenes with audiences. They don't have a ton of entourage people running around with all these, famous rock musicians so much, unless you see them walking from the stage to the parking lot or something, and they've got their people with them, their musicians or their security and stuff. You'll see Jimi Hendrix collapse once or twice because of a drug overdose that almost kills him. That wasn't his doing. So in Janice's case, she kind of meanders and clumsily stumbles through this film, talking to Morrison and getting angry at him, and talking to Jimmy and having a really nice chat about the blues and Lead Belly and stuff like that. They do want to show you a little bit of musical credibility by having Janice have a conversation about some hardcore country blues artists with Jimi Hendrix and showing that, she sort of proved to him that she had some credibility too. Still, that puts her at a disadvantage that I don't love. Let's see. I was talking about when my notes were going on about the juice. Yeah, yes, okay. So the guy, the conspiracy Facebook FBI guy, wearing a detective-y trench coat and hat, who's running through this movie, killing off these rock stars, which is the basic premise. The Nixon era U.S. government has decided that they're too dangerous; they need to be assassinated. As I said, we'll get into the other parts of that movie in the other film, the other 2 episodes with Jimmy and Jim Morrison. But he sneaks in. He snuck in and he's injected some stuff into her oranges. She makes a beverage. Then, let's see. And she clutches her stomach and dies on the floor. Then a sneaky raincoat guy comes in the room with white gloves on and does something with her fingers and a tool he has in his hand. I guess this is to create more track marks. Shades of Lenny Bruce, who, died of a drug overdose on the toilet with his pants off, and his friend found him and put his pants back on. And then the cops showed up and took his pants off and dragged him into another room and got a bunch of needles out of a box that they found in the place he was staying at. Put those out, I guess, and close by him, and then they let reporters and photographers come in 2 at a time and, see their version of how Lenny Bruce died. So then he takes all the oranges that he had poisoned and gets out of there. That's the end of Janice in this particular film. Now, did filmmaker Larry Buchanan set out to give us the definitive picture of the life of Janis Joplin? Absolutely not. Never claimed he was trying to do that. This is the man that gave us, The Naked Witch, Common Law Wife, Free White and 21, Naughty Dallas, Underage, The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, The Eye Creatures, Zontar, The Thing from Venus, Curse of the Swamp Creature, Mars Needs Women, In the Year 2889, The Other Side of Bonnie and Clyde, Strawberries Need Rain, A Bullet for Pretty Boy, The Rebel Jesus, Goodbye Norma Jean, Hughes and Harlow, Angels in Hell, Mistress of the Apes, The Loch Ness Horror, etc., etc., etc. So I'm giving this a really bad grade for portrayal of Janice because it seems either lazy or maybe opportunistic. While there's a lot of scantily clad or mostly naked women in this movie for the sake of just being titillating, and she doesn't get to have any real sex appeal, and she doesn't get to be seen, having any sort of sexual conquests at all. She just looks frumpy and is sad and frustrated and screams at people and then sings the songs that were written for the film that sound nothing like Janis Joplin. Speaking of people singing songs that sound nothing like Janis Joplin, let's talk about The Rose. All right, so a gentleman by the name of Mark Rydell directed this film very, very, very well. And obviously, I'm not a filmmaker, I'm not an expert, but I've enjoyed film enough. I've watched enough YouTube videos about what makes various movies good or bad to know. But even if I didn't watch that kind of critique, I could certainly tell you and evaluate this kind of stuff. I wouldn't talk so much about movies in this podcast if I didn't feel like I had some qualifications as an individual, not as a critic in general, not as someone who's going to tell people not to enjoy something, which is what critics do. But I do want to say, I think the director did great stuff. Everyone working on this film did great stuff. I don't see anything weak about the creation and production of this film, The Rose. Mr. Rydell was hired to do this film, and it was a Janis Joplin piece. It was a screenplay, as I said, called Pearl. He didn't want to do that, and he hated the idea of, as it was given to him, that Jane Fonda would be pretending to sing Janis Joplin type songs or Janis Joplin songs. I don't know. I didn't watch all the Criterion Edition features. I don't have that much time on my hands for this particular situation. I do have that kind of time on my hands when it comes to crazy stuff like, when Brandon Lee gets accidentally killed on the set of The Crow. That one's a doozy, and I did a lot of research in the last year about that one. And I probably alluded to that in previous episodes. That one's coming. Woo! Oh, is that coming? But I don't know if he was told at that time they were going to have the rights to Janice or the rights to her songs. I kind of doubt they were going to have the songs. That's pretty expensive stuff. I don't know that. I assume that they didn't have permission from the family or the estate to use her name, and that's why they were going to change it, and that's why she was called Pearl in the original version. But I do also cringe at the idea of Jane Fonda being out there pretending to be a bad girl, being drunk and belligerent, But he wanted a real singer that he could film in front of a crowd that was actually reacting to that singer. He used the words, I wanted to see the veins in their head. I wanted to see the raw expression. He wanted to basically, he told his director of photography, don't make it beautiful when it comes to the crowd, the live crowd and the live performing scenes of her singing with her band. He said, don't make it beautiful. I want to see the perspiration. When she's singing, it should look like she's having an abdominal operation. At that time, the concert scenes they filmed were the biggest shows Bette, my notes. When I say Bette, I think Bette Davis. Bette Midler had ever done at that point. She was a singer and a performer, but she hadn't done like big rock shows, obviously. But the director actually, when they were filming these scenes, he actually told the audience that was there, if she's no good, don't applaud. Which I love. He said, you make her win you over, which I love so much. That means wasting a lot of expensive film, though. That's the 70s for you. The music on this was produced by Paul Rothchild, and I think he was the arranger of it, and maybe he wrote some of it. I didn't look too deep into it. All that matters is Paul Rothchild's a guy that he recorded The Doors, for crying out loud. And what he came up with for this is like super duper 1979 overproduced horn section, 15 musicians in a band rock music. It's a lot of wailing vocals from Bette Midler without a lot of memorable melodies in the vocals or the guitar solos when they take guitar solos. And same with the horn parts too. Very repetitive. And this is, in 79, it's no wonder that like new wave music and then like Ozzy Osbourne's first album was just going to destroy everything in about a year or two, just take over. But, it really comes across like nothing rock. It's the kind of rock music that film people think rock music is. It's the kind of stuff, it comes off like the kind of stuff that people who graduated college with music theory, classes would put on a page. Horns should do this here. This is what horns do. This is what guitars do. This is what a vocalist, here's notes for the vocalist, and here's these cookie cutter, awful, boring lyrics. My notes are all over the place based on what I was thinking or checking in on at the time or researching while I was watching this film. But I think I have to jump down to, yes, the lyrics for Keep On Rockin'. And I watched this film with subtitles so I could get everything, including the song lyrics. Get ready. Now, I don't want to be a jerk here. I don't want to be like Steve Allen on The Tonight Show reciting Gene Vincent's lyrics of Bebop-A-Lula and sounding out of touch, because his whole point was to read rock and roll lyrics to the parents of America and laugh about how stupid rock and roll was. Bebop-A-Lula, she's my baby. Bebop-A-Lula, she's my baby. I'm not doing that here. I'm taking aim at Hollywood in the 70s and 80s, and boy, are we going to rip apart the same mentality when it comes to the other movie, Beyond the Doors or Down on Us, when we get back to the Morrison and Jimi Hendrix elements of that film. Oh, God, those lyrics are terrible. But here's Keep on Rockin'. Children of the earth, listen what I say. You made rock and roll what it is today. And no two-bit fascist is going to shoot us down. So come on, children, bring your guns to town. Shoot them down. We can rock and roll all night long. And I want to see you out there feeling strong. And I want to give you, the shots you need. I'll be a doctor. You just call on me. Call on me, baby, baby. Call me, baby, baby. Keep on rocking, keep on rocking. Keep on rock and roll, never gonna die. That makes Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution by AC/DC sound like Shakespeare by comparison. And we're gonna talk about some AC/DC soon because I just watched Maximum Overdrive for the third time. I am a big fan of AC/DC, and I don't know how to hide it. I cannot hide it. I'm gonna be very biased on that one. So, back to actually, Bette Midler, her performance. Her performing those songs is amazing. Her singing, her stage presence, her throwing herself around the stage, especially one with like 15 people in the band, is something to see for sure. And it's very compelling. It's very real. But the lyrics aren't. The song arrangements aren't. They're garbage. Not because they're bad. It's because they're so mediocre and they're so blah. They're so Hollywood calculated. Like, this is what rock bands sound like. And it's supposed to portray her as Janice, really. She gets called a hippie like 4 times in the movie. So they're trying to tread on and trade on the idea that she's a freak, because she's a hippie freak. And it's the 60s still, but it's not the 60s still, because most people have 80s haircuts, early 80s haircuts, because it's 79. A lot of the guys in the band have, more of a Western look with like feathered hair, like you would see on the Barbara Mandrell show. Remember the Barbara Mandrell show that none of you probably watch or remember? Anyways, look it up. But the way people on stage in like middle of the road rock bands played, like they look like the Marshall Tucker band. They look like Southern rock bands. A lot of them. This is 3 years. Excuse me. This is 3 years after the Sex Pistols got arrested during the Queen's Silver Jubilee for playing God Save the Queen on a boat in the Thames. That just didn't happen. Musically, this movie is its own little slice of reality as far as what it's portraying. Now, a large chunk of the film is about music business stuff. How Pearl or Rose is caught up in the machinations of this grinding, metal parts and these wheels that are just squishing her and tearing her to pieces while she's tearing herself to pieces at the same time. Going back to my notes now that I've done rambling for a little bit. Both the leads in this, including Bette Midler, of course, got nominated for Academy Awards, even though the studio that put out the movie didn't really believe in them. After the opening of the film, which is one of those setups for like, okay, something bad clearly happened, and you hear audio of Bette Midler's voice, very weak and very distant and very lost and alone and kind of croaking and stuff. And you see people gathered around like a garage bedroom kind of thing, or a teenager's bedroom where there's pictures all over the wall. They're taking photos. So something bad's happened to somebody. And then we do that where the movie's going to end where it started, which is what happens. And then we go back to the person that we're now introduced to, the performer, Rose herself, doing a big performance. There's a big uncomfortable exchange between her and her manager after that performance, where they're just in an office room in a skyscraper somewhere. And she starts saying something she'll say 4 more times, I believe, in the film. But she wants to take a year off. She's not going to make it. She doesn't want to, keep making like another few $1,000s and then not be able to do anything by this time next year. It should it should be, I don't know. I guess it should be judged less harshly than I want it to be judged, because it does try to teach you or show you a lot of things about the entertainment business and the music business in a very short amount of time. Okay. There's so many things that take place transactionally in the exchanges and between her and her manager and her and the whole, machine of the music business, while she's going from place to place to place to place to place as the movie goes on. So a lot of it is very impractical. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense from most thinking people's perspective, unless you don't know anything about rock and roll or the entertainment business and how it should work. Not saying I'm an expert, but I'll get into the details of why I judge it harshly for things that it's definitely guilty of. No idea what that sound in the background was, and I'm in my living room right now, so I'm very worried. Sounds like something metal just fell or closed or clasped around me. Oh, what next? What's coming? What's right behind me? Watched too many horror movies lately. But like the whole office, just like they have this argument, and the whole office just floods with press people, with their little notebooks, and they're asking her questions and stuff. And she makes kind of a power play in front of everybody and announces something that she and her manager haven't agreed on, and it sets up their relationship. She begs for something. He says, how can we do that? We've got so much money to make and people that we employ. Why are you being so selfish? And she goes, I know, I'm sorry. I don't want to be selfish. I'll be good. And then she acts out in some way that shows him, ha ha ha, I can still get my way. This is repeated a few times throughout the film, and I think it's done very effectively. They're not nice to each other. There's a lot of people in this film that aren't being nice to other people. So bear that in mind. If you like movies about nice people doing nice things, I mean, I don't know why you like rock and roll anyway, and I don't know why you're listening to this show now that I think about it. Maybe you're a hardcore Bette Midler fan and you just like beaches. I don't know. I don't think people that just only like beaches go looking for podcasts like this, though. So then the next scene after the office press conference scene is a gig. And she goes in backstage to where the band is getting ready and tuning up, and she wants to see the set list. And her guitarist flips his guitar up so she can read what he's got, written, presumably on a piece of paper on the back of his guitar body, which is a nice touch. I think that's cool, very practical. I think, that's something lots of people do or did before computer printers, and you would just ask one person in your band to show up with 5 set lists and stick them on the floor in front of you so you'd always have it. But the point of that conversation is she wants to cut one of their songs out of the set list. And they all argue with her about it. I mean, the idea that your singer comes to you and says, I don't want to do this song. And then you go, oh, come on, you're so good. And okay, well, then I don't want to do this song number 2 instead. Oh, but that's a great song. Nobody would do that. If you're getting paid by this person or this person's manager, but, she's the star, what she says goes. This is not, it's not, their band is not a democracy. The way they show this band existing, she doesn't really have a big, a great rapport with them or a personal relationship with anybody in the band. They're definitely portrayed as hired people. There's nothing in the story about her bringing her band up with her from her hometown or something. She's just a big famous rock and roll star that has 15 people in her band. So her thing is she's trying to give her voice a break, and she has to yell and start screaming at all these people in the room with her backstage. They only have a career because she's, a star. And she wants to give her voice a break for one song. By the way, this is also why bands have drum solos during shows that are too long, and guitar solos. People go backstage and they get some water or drugs or sex, and then they come back up when, John Bonham is done beating the tar out of his drums with his bare hands. Or by the time Geddy Lee is done with his bass solo, or by the time Kirk Hammett's done with his not great guitar solos. Sorry, tangent. He's a better guitarist than me, but still. I saw him in 92, and he went on for a very long time. I was still in awe of him at that point. I didn't know how he did all that magic on the fretboard, but he was still a very long guitar solo. Anyhow, so that's sort of strike number one, I think, for real, for me, for the disbelief meter is kind of starting to go ding, ding, when it comes to actual realistic music person stuff. And as I will qualify many times in many other episodes, because I can't assume anyone that's listening to this is listening to my other episodes, I am a musician. I'm a professional musician in the same way that a person who goes to a VFW hall and like jumps off the top turnbuckle in a wrestling ring that he helped set up himself and crashes through fluorescent light tubes and walks away with like $50 for the night is a professional wrestler, right? I've done music for a long time, most of my life. I'm not obviously anyone that's known in the industry, but that doesn't mean I haven't seen how the stuff works. And I'm talking from a point of view of someone who's seen how it works with personal relationships with people, in being in bands together, making shows happen, promoting shows, putting on shows. I mean, all the stuff, all the writing, all the touring in a van, all the desperate things you do. So no, I can't criticize what it's like when they portray people that are rich and famous, but I can criticize some of the basics of what they portray here that does not make sense. Back to my direct notes from while I was watching the film. It should go without saying that Bette Midler is something to behold in this film. I wish they would have been upfront with the kind of drugs she's supposedly doing, because she keeps saying she's clean and they don't show her shooting up, they don't imply she's shooting up heroin until the very, very end of the film. Spoiler alert, by the way, spoilers here on out. She has wild mood swings and sudden changes in demeanor and energy, going from being unable to walk to prancing around on stage like a demon possessed. And of course, this is great at communicating what a consummate performer she must be to overcome all these, problems she's having physically just at the sight of a crowd of adoring fans. Another note about the music. God, the songs are anti-rock and roll in the worst way. The undercover way, not the upfront way like a Pat Boone song. Just nothing to them but arrangement and production. The lyrics are totally devoid of urgency or danger or tension or desire, as we've covered. What the hell is with her management wanting her to play nice for the press? Yeah, because the manager just like, don't say motherfucker when you go out there. Please, there's a lot of press people that we need their help. We need them to like you. And so she goes out and says, hey, motherfuckers, right away. I said, it's the job of rock and roll to shove that shit down their throats. This 2 years after the Sex Pistols, you dorks. And as I said earlier, this is actually 3 years after they played the Silver Jubilee, so they'd been around longer than that. She does a speech rant on stage that's definitely in character for Janice. She was great at these, Janis Joplin. Her whole routine here in the film is pretty charming. Totally inappropriate to go into When a Man Loves a Woman after that, though. Tell you this is, I think, better than seeing some modern retelling on stage with a pretty-looking, unbluesy musical theater sprite on her way up the ladder of success in Broadway, doing a poor imitation of a tragic rock and roll singer. I know there was a Janis Joplin off-Broadway thing going on a while ago. I don't think it was Janice Lives or Love Janice or something to that effect. I haven't seen it. I don't know anything about it. All I know is lead singer in one of my bands is a woman who knows Janice and knows the stuff, has sung some of her stuff on stage next to me. It's always fun to go into Mercedes-Benz for her when there's a technical problem with the guitars or the drums or whatever and we can't play. So she gets the crowd to sing along to that. This is not coming from nowhere. Just saying, she saw something that was a Janis Joplin musical off-Broadway in Seattle thing at like Fifth Avenue Theater or whatever. I asked her how it was. She said it was fine. It was good. The story was good. Acting was good. Everyone's good. The singing's great, but it's still a musical theater person trying to sing blues and rock and roll, and it doesn't work. It doesn't sound authentic at all. Not everybody can do that stuff. Just because someone is good at tattooing, portraits of people's faces on your skin doesn't mean they're good at doing intricate, geometric, black line work. Not everybody can do everything. at least Bette Midler, I can imagine cracking a bottle of whiskey, Southern Comfort, over Jim Morrison's head, like Janis Joplin did. Another note on the music: while I was typing that bit, I wrote, "Excuse me, there's a horrifically honky-fied harmonica solo," alliteration, "that's too perfectly harmonized by the other members of the horn section happening as I write this, and it's destroyed what little sex drive I had left for the rest of the year." When I say honky-fied, I don't mean honk, honk, honk on the harmonica. I just mean boring white person non-bluesiness. Then, after this opening show, this powerhouse of a show where she started all messed up and she was worn out and she goes out there and gives a performance of a lifetime, there's this rush to get her in the air and take her to like Long Island and meet a group called Billy Ray and the Hillbilly Boys, which features Harry Dean Stanton playing the leader of this sort of like hillbilly band or something. I'm not clear on if they're like a bluegrass group or like folky country music, or if they're like a modern day, like late 70s country style band that would have been on the radio with your Kenny Rogerses and your Dolly Partons and Crystal Gales and Willie Nelsons and stuff. It's not clear, but because her character, like Janice, does have a love of Americana folk music, and she, they rush her off to meet this man and his band, and it's talked about the fact that, she covered one of his songs on her album, or a song that he covered, and she did a version of it as well. And he takes issue with it and takes issue with her being vulgar in front of him and his band and his, members of his family and such. I love the fakeness around the rush to take her away to meet him. Like, why would they do that right after a show when she's already worn out? There's an argument with her and her manager right after that, and she kind of busts him on the idea, I think, you're trying to sign him to one of your management contracts, and he can't really justify doing it otherwise. So I like her launching into her manager for the betrayal, and then some guy rolls up and starts talking dirty to her without any reciprocation, and she bashes him in the face with a bottle. It's pretty great. I mean, not that he deserved that kind of level of bodily harm for making a couple of comments about, oral sex in that moment, but he deserves it for the 2,000 other times that person definitely did the same thing to an unsuspecting woman, all added up together. So then she's so angry. By the way, I'm not going to do like a blow-by-blow account of this whole film, but some of this stuff is really, I think, worth dissecting and talking about because it's so good. And then other things just don't really add up very well practically. From there, she runs off with a limo driver. She sees a limo for Harry Dean Stanton's character, who, by the way, was rude to Bette Midler on the set, she said, in an interview I watched on the documentary. I didn't watch all of them. Like I said, I watched enough. Just enough to get a little sort of feel for how this movie was made and the people looking back at it and how they felt after the fact. Yeah, he was a real dick to her, and that sucks. I think that's crappy. I love Harry Dean Stanton in everything I've seen him in, but you know what? He does the exact same thing in every film. Is he a great actor? Probably, but I don't think he's shown that he's got an amazing range and all the cool stuff that we love him for. And I don't understand why you would need to be a bad person to other actors behind the scenes, because all this method acting nonsense, I think, is just proof that people like Daniel Day-Lewis can't actually act. Yes, on screen they're amazing, but if they have to stay in character during the entire filming of something and they have to treat people poorly, I don't think that means you're not a good actor. No one's asking my opinion on this. I know. So she goes, she throws a ton of cash at this limo driver. It's Harry Dean Stanton's driver for the night. He was hired for the night. And he just thinks it's so amusing that he goes for it. He takes off with her and tells her he likes her songs and he knows who she is. And they make a whole night of it in New York. She's a Southern girl from Florida with no accent. Again, Janice being portrayed by someone who's definitely not from Texas. And they end up going to a drag club. And it's a big, lavish sort of New York cocktail lounge kind of a club. And it's a big production. It's really, it's something to see, the way they shot in this really dark nightclub with all these cool lights and people coming out. I mean, I know this is not like rocket science. People have been able to do this for a long time with lenses and lights and crap like that. But I don't know. Nowadays, I wonder how much work all that was, how to set everything up and what kind of lenses to use and how much light makes it still look like it's a dingy, dark nightclub. But and not dingy in a dirty way, just dingy in a sort of smoky atmosphere kind of way. Because it looks pretty plush, as a matter of fact, in there. I mean, you'd want to hang out at this place, unless you really hated drag queens. But they settle in, her and her new friend, whose name is Dyer, Houston Dyer. And turns out he's from the South, too. He's from Texas. And they're enjoying the first performer. And then the second performer comes out and starts doing a routine that's clearly Rose. It's one of her songs, and he knows Rose. She has friends here. They make that clear when she comes in. She's kind of going to a safe place in New York City for her. And the funny thing that I thought was the guy doing her bit actually has a voice that sounds like Axl Rose. And this is 1979. Someone, if you know Axl Rose, I believe his full original name is W. Axl Rose. Check in with him and call me here and let me know if that's where he got the inspiration for his very, very unique vocal style, rock and roll vocal style for Guns N' Roses. Mr. W. Axl Rose. I know his name is William Bailey. I know. I grew up in the 80s. So that escalates. These other drag queens come out and they bring her on stage and you get to see the first real indication that the party never stops for her. Even, if she wanted to just be left in a safe place and just kind of clap for people performing, she is going to get dragged on stage and she's going to, reciprocate. She's going to give everyone a show and everyone loves it. Everyone loves her. She can't turn that down. Now, she's not totally innocent. She didn't go to the public library after all, but it sets up a precedent that's going to repeat over and over and over and over again in this film. And then they end up in a hotel room together, and the scenes of them in the hotel room in bed together, the morning after, are really sweet and fun and cute and endearing. They're sincere and they're physically believable. Oh, that's how people behave. I forgot after so many CGI blockbuster movies in the last 20 years. Speaking of movies in the last 20 years or ever, I've never been able to go into this much detail reviewing so many films in a row. And it all reminds me of how much more trashy movie reviewers truly are than the thing they're supposed to be appreciating, supposedly. Siskel and Ebert when I was a kid, and then we became Ebert and Roper later. Or anyone. Anyone that's not Joe Bob Briggs, I guess, that does that job for a living. Or some really cool, some more niche sort of appreciators of film out there. They do a great job of reviewing movies or explaining movies and what's great about them. But the rest of them are just like music journalists, as we touched on in a very recent, right before this episode. Their goal is to direct your attention toward what they want you to like and away from anything they disapprove of, to the point that their true identity is their identity is oh, you little lambs don't know any better, so I'll be your hero and your protector and explain why these big, important Hollywood people don't deserve your attention or your money. Just watch what I prescribe. Don't question how it only takes 3 minutes of discussion to cover everything about this movie that you need to know. Their whole life is just dedicated to being pompous and obsolete. And yet friends of ours on social media still think it's important for them to post the top 10 summer movies this year so far, or their own top 10 directors of the 2020s, as if anyone needs to know, as if there's any qualifications there. Only real, insightful intellectuals with a heart of gold and no ulterior motives like myself are worth listening to, people. Don't you ever forget it, or I'll come over there. I'll come over there and do something. Back to my notes. At various times through the film, she does a lot of confessing, panic, begging, lashing out, and it's all believable for the most part. Some of her randomness is a bit out of place. Like, it's not random enough. She's like just going up the stairs with Dyer right before a show or right before some other conversation with somebody else in the business, and she just goes, "Do I look old?" But like the thing before it and the thing after it made that like not jarring enough. She was like very soft, very casual, and then but she lets it go. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's supposed to be that's supposed to be believable, but that there's a lot of parts of the movie that could be described as sad lady makes loud noises, alternating with loud lady makes sad noises. But she's also very, very clever and fires off a lot of great one-liners throughout the whole story. She's never at a loss for something cool to say before she starts then breaking down and crying. And also, further into my notes, a lot of the rock and roll elements of this story are complete horseshit. No manager books a string of live shows and then from the stage goes straight to air travel to a personal appearance with someone who doesn't want to meet her, to early in the morning, a recording studio date. No one goes from the stage to the studio to record any vocals that are important enough to keep. No one would spend the money he's complaining about, the manager, in these scenes, wasting and losing because she like loses track of time and doesn't show up when she's supposed to record in the studio the day after a huge show. They would finish the tour, then take a month off. I'm talking about like famous people here, you know, not indie rock bands as they exist today. And many indie rock bands have to go back to their day jobs anyway on like food trucks when they get home or whatever they do. To spend trust fund money or something, or working remotely. But, you know, they don't stop a tour and then book studio time the then following morning right away. I'm saying just like the rock and roll elements of the business in this film make as much sense as the way they're portrayed in Down on Us. Also, I guess it's important for us to believe that Janis Joplin had sex with her whole high school football team in one night. Because that's a big thing for this character. And that comes back at the end. It becomes relevant at the very finale of the film when she goes back home. Now, let's talk about Houston Dyer, the chauffeur. This fella, I saw his face and I thought, like, this dude has to be in some other films. And not because I directly recognized him, just because it was just a very cool, interesting looking face. And I looked him up. Turns out he played Chef in Apocalypse Now, also in 1979, the same year as this. And then there's a part of Apocalypse Now who's when Chef is yelling for the Playboy bunnies in the from the crowd where he's at. One of them is played by a woman named Colleen Camp. And for years from this point, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, she would be playing one of the moms in the movie Valley Girl. Valley Girl is another episode coming up and is going to be a lot of fun. So I had to include that little detail. He looks like Ted Raimi to me, this guy. I think that's what kind of threw me off. Like a tall Ted Raimi. Like if Ted Raimi was like if you could use the word dashing to describe Ted Raimi. He also went on to be in at least 3 other films with Harry Dean Stanton. He played one of my favorite authors of all time, Dashiell Hammett, in 2 different films, and I don't know enough about what Dashiell Hammett looks like to know if that was appropriate or not. Big one, though, for anyone that came up in the 90s watching movies, there was a film called Falling Down, starring Michael Douglas. At one point, Michael Douglas ends up in the basement of a surplus store, Army-Navy surplus store, with a store owner that turns out to be like a crazed fascist sympathizer, neo-Nazi guy. And that is this same actor. His name is Frederick Forrest. Isn't that fun? Isn't that nice to know? Aren't you glad you know that? I am. let's hop away from the movie for just a minute here and actually talk about Janice. Looking at this portrayal of her, and it is a portrayal of her for all intents and purposes, but it's also a great vehicle for Bette Midler. For that, I love it. I love what I've seen. As I said, I'm not like someone who chases down Bette Midler stuff. So as uninterested and unbiased as I am about Bette Midler, I was blown away by this. Despite all the things I hate about this movie, which is not a lot. It's just, three major things that recur, that happen over and over again. As I said, the awful songs. I actively hate what it tries to do to Janice without taking responsibility for the awful songs dressed up to trick you into thinking they're great. It's what dumb movie people think sells rock and roll records and builds a fan base just in the middle of the road, non-specific. Oh, wait, that is exactly what sells. Never mind. But still, the songs from Josie and the Pussycats are way better. The movie, not the cartoon. Janice kind of gets dragged around in this film and in Down on Us. And I think if you don't believe that's partly because she's a woman, you might be wrong. I think it's entirely 90% because she's a woman. Because she was not seen as someone who had a lot of visionary, star power mystique like Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, her peers. They seem to be more in control. People make more excuses for their drugged up behavior, and half the time, even if they don't just think it's cool, they think, oh, well, that was just so part of their manipulation of people. It was part of the game. They weren't really that messed up all the time. Her story, there also isn't a lot of mystery around her death. With Jimmy and with Jim Morrison, people wanted there to be a conspiracy. People wanted there to be another reason why they died besides them actually putting drugs in themselves and their body expiring. People gave them way more credit than they gave Janice. And so, a drugged up and boozy woman is just a problem all the time. A drugged up and boozy Jim Morrison is a problem to the people that are around him all the time, like his bandmates, but not to the public. There's nothing to the public in general. Unless you just hate Jim Morrison, then it's just fuel for you to hate Jim Morrison and tell people he sucks. Granted, Jimi Hendrix didn't misbehave like those two did. But people don't speak about Janice's genius as much as her wasted talent and powerful voice. But there wasn't a lot of clamoring for unreleased alternate tracks or demos that were hidden in the vault, in the wake of her death that I'm aware of. Now, maybe you know better than I. Call in, let me know. But from someone who came, to adulthood reading lots of guitar magazines and music biographies, I never got the impression that there was like a whole industry machine dedicated to tracking down lost rarities of hers. There was eventually a compact disc box set that collected all of her stuff. I have to say, in the fullness of time and what I got to hear well after the fact, I'm a very uncool person when it comes to Janice because I really like the later stuff she did with this Full Tilt Boogie Band more so than with the early records she made, like Cheap Thrills with Big Brother and the Holding Company. Like if the Live at Winterland album with them is any indication, there's a lot of filler and there's a lot of her not being the lead singer as much as I would rather listen to. And with the later band and the later recordings, her soulfulness and her R&B sort of fueled voice comes out a lot more clearly and a lot more effectively, I say, just my opinion. I mean, I'm rock and roll till the day I die, but I think Big Brother and the Holding Company was one of those bands that had a lot of people that wanted things to be a democracy, and I'll find out more about those details later as I get into that part of the biography that I was mentioning earlier, and see maybe what the dynamics of that band were like. But holy smokes, if those whole crowds weren't so off their tits on booze and pills and acid, weed, whatever, I don't know that a lot of audiences would really sit through something like Light is Faster Than Sound. It's a boring song with a guy with a droning voice and then Janice like harmonizing with it. I mean, comparing that to, Move Over later on, it's so much more rewarding for me to hear her later stuff. And that's what I recommend to a casual listener. Because of the nature of her recording career, I would say don't be shy about just listening to the hits with Janis and then going deeper after that. It's not the Doors. With the Doors, with Jimi Hendrix, I would say kind of the opposite. I would say you've already heard the greatest hits probably, and they're fantastic. But, instead of hearing like those covers that Jimmy's known for, like Hey Joe and All Along the Watchtower, go delve deep into some of the stuff from Electric Ladyland, from First Raise the New Rising Sun, one of his posthumous albums, Band of Gypsies. I mean, hear the kind of range the guy had. And I should save more of this for the Jimi Hendrix episode, so I'll stop there. But the Doors had a lot of great weird stuff that was effective and still catchy, unlike a lot of psychedelic bands and garage bands at the time. Again, that's another conversation for another episode. But with Janice, check out her rendition of Summertime from Porgy and Bess. Check out Get It While You Can. I mean, if you don't know why she's so appealing and why people went bonkers for her, unlike, again, Jimmy and Jim, as the two that are in this movie with her, obviously not the Rose, down on us. Unlike them, she wasn't cool in terms of coming off cool in interviews. Like she was provocative and she kind of, she could bandy words back and forth, sure. But I don't think was as mysterious again as the other two. And she was in a lot of pain that she just left out there in front of everybody. Morrison didn't do that. Hendrix didn't do that. I don't know who's done that. In the modern era, there's more. It's okay. In the post-punk era, for sure. And I mean after punk. I don't mean the post-punk era of music specifically at that part of the early 80s only. I mean anything that came after punk and alternative music, being really but still there's a lot of those artists are still pretty contrived when it comes to the way they're allowing themselves to be seen in the press or in public. And Janice just was, when she was miserable, she was miserable. When she was hurt, and she let you know. And she lets you know on stage in the vamping in the middle of a song. When she lets you know, I mean, it was like, I think it's Tell Mama, the live version of Tell Mama, that I love. And I can't pinpoint it right now off the top of my head as to where you can find it, because I don't know online, like compared to what compact disc I originally heard it on, or, YouTube or whatever, which festival it was at. But I mean, she goes into a rant, like a really charming, beautiful talk about love and relationships. And, you're a young cat, man, you're 16, 17 years old. You're just getting yourself together. You're just figuring out the world and what you need, man. And she'll talk about like ex-boyfriends and stuff in the middle of a song, not by name, but she'll get into like, and like the dumb Capricorn I am, when you come back to me after doing me wrong, I'll take you right back and I'll say, let mama take care of you. She's so good. She's so powerful. It's weak. And then at the same time in the same song, and it's just so compelling and it's so human. And she is letting it all out for you. It's amazing. I would rather hear that, than a lot of the women at the time that sang better, in quotes, She was raunchy too and nasty, and, she messed with people like right in front of their face. Like she wasn't so much the kind to be manipulative and strategic, I guess is the word I'm looking for. She was not strategic. She tried every now and then. I'll get to that there's some details about her biography and, things I think it was Joe Namath thing. She said, she told her publicist to call the Times and tell them I slept with Joe Namath twice. Something like that. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. So, if you're Janice, you don't get to have the mystique. Because you were too honest. You flailed around too much in front of people. There wasn't enough mystery. And while, as I said earlier, there wasn't as much unearthing things from the vaults that she had recorded. And I think because she was such a hard worker in the studio and just, cranked stuff out and just did the thing, didn't have a million she'd have experimental type music where they reworked songs a million times and recorded a bunch of different sort of arrangements of it necessarily. But the flip side is now you can go on YouTube and you can find recordings of her singing in a coffee house from 1964 or so. Singing songs by Odetta and Ma Rainey. Really raw stuff. You can hear how powerful her voice. She didn't get powerful as she got famous. She was that person. Her voice was that way. From way back when she was a teenager and in her early 20s. And she had a point to make to people. She hit her teen years, her mid-teens, and had no tits. And she had horrible, horrible, horrible acne on her face. Her parents took her to a dermatologist specialist who would burn off her acne with dry ice. And then blame Janice herself when her acne failed to clear up, even though later on they would find out that was an ineffective treatment. She felt like the ugliest person in the world as a teenager. She knew in her hometown, if you're a teenage girl and you ain't got no tits and you aren't pretty, you are nobody. You have no future at all. She realized she was going to be nobody or just die alone or be a problem. She was going to be a problem. She was going to be annoying. She was going to make people remember her. She was not going to be a ghost. She worked on a really abrasive laugh, a cackle, when she was 15. She would try it out in front of her best friend. Ask her, is it grating enough? Was it annoying enough? And you hear that in lots of interviews. You hear that in the audio, in the video footage, the film reels and stuff. It became, I think, more of her natural thing. When I was a child and I sneezed, I just sneezed. And then after years and years of seeing cartoons where cartoon characters said achoo when they sneezed, I started saying achoo when I sneezed. And now I still do it. Doesn't make any sense. I think she retained that. And I think even when she was laughing naturally as she got into her 20s, that abrasive cackle became her natural laugh more than anything. Perhaps not. Perhaps when she was having intimate times with people behind closed doors and no one else was paying attention, maybe then she had another voice, another laughter, another kind of laughter that was her real original one from being a kid. But it's cool to hear it burst out of her in interview footage when, some dude sitting not 2 feet away from her with a microphone has the balls to say, "Do you have any explanation why you're so popular?" And she just, just like a Muppet monster laugh. If you grew up with the Muppet Monsters in the 70s and 80s, the way they would, it's almost like that coming out of this amazing woman who's real, who's not a creation of somebody else, fantasy creation. Back to another piece of the whole thing with the rose I wanted to touch on. Go back to was that everyone I saw in the interview said, no, it wasn't Janice. We didn't want to do Janice. But the fucking script name was Pearl. They collected money and fame and attention for this film by presenting it as the story of Janice without saying it was Janice. And everyone who saw it back in the day knew it was a Janice biopic. And in that way, they wanted the legacy of Janice's to profit from, and the death of Janice to profit from. And the public desire for the story of Janice in a time before there were, biographies written of her. Even though a lot of the songs sound more like Sammy Hagar songs than Janis Joplin songs. And by the way, when it comes to rock bios, rock life stories, there's something about Texas, man. There's something about performers from Texas. It's always, all their origin stories are full of carnage. It's like Janis Joplin, Steve Earle, Al Jurgensen, Stevie Ray Vaughan, the Butthole Surfers. Like, there's so much conflict. There's so much blood and guts. It's not the Graham Parsons story, which I'm getting to very soon. It's not Florida. It's not growing up the son of a Florida citrus magnate, whatever you would call their family. They're the proprietor of their estate. Not the story of a trust fund country musician came to California to change the rock and roll timeline forever in his own way. But that's going to be a good one we're going to get to very soon. Almost did that one instead of this today, but instead of rewatching Grand Theft Parsons, I watched The Rose for the first time and watched Down on Us for the first time. Before going into more of Janice's actual life, I want to mention one more actor from this film, David Keith, who, when I saw he was listed in the credits at the beginning and titles, I was like, oh, the guy from They Live who has the street fight with Rowdy Piper that's been in like a million movies, and his voice is awesome. And he's the voice of, in modern days, he's the voice of the president in Rick and Morty. But no, not him. I think that's Keith David. He was also in The Thing. He was in The Thing, directed by John Carpenter, co-starring alongside Mr. Kurt Russell, who played Elvis in the movie Elvis, directed by John Carpenter, which we're getting to in another episode as well. Anyway, he plays a young man in an airborne, Rangers, I guess, Army uniform at a bar, and Rose calls him over to their table and decides that she's going to take him along with Houston Dyer, and this young man is going to be her new bodyguard on tour. This is one thing that I will say the movie does well about capturing the rock and roll energy. The franticness and the randomness of performers. When performers, whether it's stage people, rock and roll people, when they go out, all bets are off. We don't have normal nights out. Sometimes just if anything that could happen doesn't happen, you make it happen. You provoke it. You grab someone, you bring them into your group, and you make them a bunch of new friends, and then you bring them into your tribe and your troop, and you see what it provokes, what chaos that creates. And I don't know, yes, party people do that in general. Yes, partiers that do lots of drugs and drink a lot, yes, they do that. Not saying it's only a musician thing, but I've seen it. And I see it in this movie, and it's legitimately well portrayed. It's believable. Right. So here's where we break, okay, in the episode. From here on out, it's going to be a lot more random. You know, I got fairly procedural when it came to Andy Wood and Chris Cornell on my second episode about singles, of which there are at least 2 more coming. So I need to cover Pearl Jam, and I need to cover Alice in Chains, and there's going to be a whole lot of other Seattle bands wrapped up in those too. I've had a lot of different thoughts during this last week about what I wanted to say on this episode, and they're going to be coming at you not in sequential order. I don't care. It's got to be. If I'm going to get this done, I'm not going to lose another couple of days restructuring everything in like a chronological order or a timeline of Janice's life. I feel like I've spent a whole lot of time front loading this with the movie talk. So let's get into the music talk, and I'm going to do it in a way that's not conventional, but feels energetic and honest. And if I try to redo it all, it's not going to be energetic and honest. I'll say this. I'm going to be emotional about this one. I'm not going to be all NPR about it. Let's put it that way. This stuff's important, and this woman's life is important. You know, academics love to downplay the effect of rock and roll on our culture. And they love it because, like, somebody burst the fantasy bubble about Elvis a long time ago. Like, Elvis wasn't actually all that talented or responsible for anything, supposedly, because of his manipulation by his manager, or the fact that he, popularized white music that was taken from black music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As I've said, we're going to get into that in multiple episodes too about Elvis. I don't know if that's the cause. I don't know what the fuck it is. All right, I don't know what the problem is with academics and their dismissal of rock and roll, especially as it applies to feminism. And I'm no one to speak on feminism from an academic sense. I'm not even going to go into what that word even means, because that word means different things to different people. But I personally dislike the fact that nobody talks about the same way no one ever brings up Rob Halford's name when it comes to gay icons. No one seems to bring up Janis Joplin when it comes to feminist icons. And maybe it is because she got raked over the coals so hard. Maybe it's because she was too, hard to replicate, too hard to imitate. She was so random at times and so focused at other times and so gutsy. I know it's not as informative for me to just like praise somebody on a podcast. I'm getting there. I promise we're getting there. But I think it's worth your while as a listener to understand this subject matter is different for me. Okay. I did not spend decades listening to Janis Joplin. It hurts to listen to Janis Joplin for me. I admire her so much, and she just rips out my guts every time I get like a face full of her live footage and how raw she is, but then how focused she is, and then how she like turns on a dime and changes the emotion of everyone in a festival crowd in front of her. I can't keep going back to that because I'll never get anything done. But, I'm sure a lot of academics or, feminist historians don't enjoy the idea of giving Janice any credit for women's liberation, was what it was called at the time before it was called feminism. She didn't write a book that they, had to pay $75 for in a college class that they took with the word feminism written in heavy type all over the front. I've been in bands with women in the era of the 21st century, and it's hard enough for them, let alone what it would have been like for someone like Janis Joplin in the late 1960s, especially having come from where she came from. If you hear noise, it's because there's traffic nearby. My doors and windows are open because it's very hot. It's early July right now. I don't have air conditioning. So the odd truck going up the hill might come through the noise gate, and I don't care. I don't want to lose this energy right now. I would fear to think in terms of like the modern era, what would happen to Janice. If she lived through the 80s to have like that Bonnie Raitt or Melissa Etheridge like production, poured over her really raspy bluesiness or her outrageous soul performances. I don't know. Would they have pulled her in for like a guest vocal on the first Wilson Phillips album, for crying out loud? Because of who Wilson Phillips's parents were. Maybe there's a connection there. If she had lived, she would have been doing some recording dates. Maybe she would have toured with Joan Jett. Maybe she would have played shows with like the Donnas backing her up. That would be a dream of mine for sure. And a time machine fantasy if I could make that happen. Or co-headlining a show with Dolly Parton. Maybe she would have gone folkier and bluegrassier, like, Dolly Parton went back to at a certain era of her career. I don't know. It's the what would happen if they had lived game for me usually ends at the premise of it. It's like, well, they wouldn't have lived. If they lived a day later, they would have killed themselves or died another week after that or a month after that. Most of the people that we talk about when it comes to what if they hadn't died so young. I also want to point out that like her emergence as the first female rock and roll star, this is long before other people learned from the tragedy of her life. And this is before like Susie and the Banshees in the 70s. This is before Madonna. This is before Gaga. This is before Amanda Palmer. All right. Women at the top of the charts that have built-in mystery and have control. Some modicum of control, maybe at the beginning, that gets bigger and bigger and becomes more control later. I'm sure early on in all their careers, there was a different amount of control that they had and not the same. Now, if I'm wrong about the feminism stuff in terms of, the history and the writings and all that stuff, obviously I didn't go to college for that. I'm happy to be corrected. I'm just speaking from a place of defense of rock and roll in general and certainly not anti-feminism, not anti-feminist. I mean, all you need to know about me, I assume, in the modern era when it comes to feminism is I loved Game of Thrones. I loved the books. I loved the TV show when it came out until the last season. Now, depending on what reviews you read and what online blogs you read and what YouTube channels you pay attention to, like in Game of Thrones, that makes me a misogynist or a militant feminist, depending on what you choose to believe. There you go. That's all I got. But I don't know that. Like, I feel like there was a time when it was understood by the people who saw it happen that rock and roll was affecting a lot of social change, and that gets downplayed a lot now. Like, that doesn't sell now, possibly because rock and roll is part of a very corrupt entertainment business that takes the power away from those people as time goes on. So, moving on from that part of the conversation, or that part of just sort of my thoughts around this, because it really does come home when you watch these two movies back to back, right? There's no, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but there's no apparently thought at any time to portraying Janice as someone highly intelligent and driven and anything more than just raw talent. I think that's it. I think that's what pisses me off. It's the fact that she's portrayed as just like raw talent that's flailing around and falling into the arms of every single person she meets and being manipulated and making people's lives hard. And then going on stage and, being loved and adored. There's no portrayal of her discussing like arrangements. There's never a portrayal of her in the studio, making a case to the other musicians for why a mix should sound a certain way or maybe why they shouldn't do extra takes. I mean, I was just watching footage of her in the studio with Big Brother and the Holding Company on their first album. And I'm talking about how many times they're going to redo something until they get it right. And she's trying to point out that, well, when all the stuff that's up front is up front, meaning in the mix when it's produced and what the listener's ear is going to hear, like she's like, it's going to be the vocal. And I think that a lot of bands get get burned out in the studio because they're trying to get perfect takes on the instruments when a lot of that's going to be downplayed for the listener compared to what's really going to be popping in the center of the mix. And the loudest part of the mix is going to be vocals. Who cares? Like sometimes, who cares if your guitar is perfect the 17th time you play that take? Like, unless you're making Master of Puppets, which is another conversation entirely that we will probably find a way to get to. Call in if you know what movie I should use for an episode on Master of Puppets. I want to go back to the setup here, back to the beginning of Janice's life in Port Arthur, Texas, a place where what's happening never happens there, as she said. I want to read a passage from Alice Eccles' book, Scars of Sweet Paradise. I think it's really well researched, and I think it tells the story very well. And it sets there's a lot of musical biographies where you just end up skipping the first few chapters because you don't care about their family, you don't care about their upbringing, you want to get to where they got their first gigs and learn to play out live or whatever. But in this case, I want to read directly from the text for a few paragraphs when it comes to Port Arthur in Texas, where she grew up. She says, Alice Eccles says, blue-collar and white-collar workers and their families may have mingled, but blacks and whites in Port Arthur lived strictly separate lives. In the 1950s, think about that. That's maybe 70 to 75 years ago, depending on when you're listening to this recording. The life of one human being, right? If you think a lot has changed, but it hasn't been that long. Port Arthur was 40% black, with significant numbers of Cajuns and Mexican Americans too. Segregation was the rule. Indeed, to avoid integrating the high school, the town built another one outside the city limits. Racism was so much a part of the town's fabric that, okay, I'm going to give you a warning here. There's going to be some racial slurs coming your way, all right? This is the 1950s in Texas. This is not modern conversation. If you object to hearing the sound of racist language, I'm telling you now it's coming your way next. Racism was so much a part of the town's fabric that nigger knocking, where whites would hang out of speeding cars wielding wooden boards and take aim at black pedestrians, was a favorite pastime among white teens. Those who tried to breach the color line found few opportunities to do so. When one of Janice's friends got involved in an impromptu game of touch football with some black kids, the police promptly broke it up. Racial containment was pursued all the more vigorously in the South in these years when the civil rights movement and rock and roll were upending the logic and practice of segregation. Rock and roll concerts and dances promoted the very mixing of races and cultural styles segregationists feared would lead to mongrelization of America. In the spring of 1956, the segregationist Asa Carter led a campaign to have rock and roll records removed from all jukeboxes in Birmingham and Anniston, Alabama. The same year, San Antonio, Texas, banned rock and roll from the jukeboxes at its public swimming pools. To many segregationists, rock and roll was nothing less than an NAACP plot. NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Pardon me for that pause. I had to think in my head. I'm too used to seeing the initialization of it and not sound out the words. Rock and roll was nothing less than an NAACP plot to pull white men, this is a quote, down to the level of the Negro. The author then goes on to discuss the changing demographics in Port Arthur in the modern day, how much more it's now predominantly black with a strong, influx of Vietnamese population. But the author talks about having gone there to research Janis Joplin. And when she goes into the Museum of the Gulf Coast and there's, some caretaker that's asking her, what she's studying and what she's researching and how she can help her. She lets the woman know she's she's there looking for background on Janis Joplin, and the woman wants to make it very clear that she never approved of Janis. Isn't that God. Now let's talk about her family. Her mom was an interesting sort of feature in her life. Her mom was very I don't know if I want to say controlling, but she wanted to keep things on track. She wanted to keep things manageable, and she wanted Janis to be more like other girls, of course. And Janis develops this beautiful soprano voice as a young girl, and it pleases her mother initially, but around the time of Janis turning 6 years old, her mom, Dorothy, buys her a secondhand upright piano and teaches her how to play nursery rhymes on it, and Janis loves it. She loves just like banging away on this piano, but it didn't last for very long. Her father, Seth, gets rid of the piano when Janis's mother, Dorothy, has to have a thyroid operation that changes her voice. It damages her vocal cords, and now she can't sing anymore. Her mom can't sing anymore. Therefore, Janis singing and playing music upsets her. So the father decides piano has to go, because the father in this situation is going to be the guy that makes things okay whenever the mom is upset, apparently, from what I've read. Now, I also have to backtrack a bit on a comment I made earlier when I talked about the film Down on Us and the engineers in the studio saying, "Oh, she's getting married on Saturday," and I was like, I don't know if that was a thing. No, it wasn't a thing about her getting married on Saturday. It was a thing that she had fallen in love with a man who she'd been seeing for 4 months before her death. And on the day she died, it was a Saturday, and she was calling City Hall to find out about getting a marriage license. So she had announced an engagement, yes, and she was with someone who it doesn't sound like a lot of her friends were super keen on. But interestingly enough, his name was Seth, and her father's name was Seth. Read into that what you will. I have no desire to. When it comes to her parents, one social worker who counseled Janis once described her mother, Dorothy, as very straight, very staid, very somber. If she had a passion, it was in the dark of night somewhere. One of her friends named Jim Langdon, who I believe was interviewed in the Last 24 Hours documentary about Janis, says, Dorothy was very straight-laced, critical, rigid, and cool, not a warm person. She's remembered as having a forceful and extraordinarily controlling personality. And, when it comes to her dad, he was emotionally distant and may have been an alcoholic. He was very private. He was more monk-like. I think he needed to be in the background and not make a lot of decisions. He wanted time to himself. But he was, I think, a little more supportive of Janis in general. Apparently, they didn't really fight in front of the kids. It sounds like Seth was the type to just sort of make himself scarce when Dorothy was in a bad mood. When Janis was young, Dorothy got really angry at him for telling her stories of his college days when he was making bathtub gin with his friends. And instead of standing up for himself, he just put an end to his nightly chats with his own daughter when he got home from work. That was how he would get along, and then just retreat further and further and further into himself and away from an intimate relationship with his daughter and wife. To quote my second favorite private detective of all time, rather fictional private detective of all time, not that I haven't known any real ones, Jessica Jones. Aren't relationships great? Anyhow, let's move on to more misery for Janis growing up in Port Arthur, Texas. There were stories about, like, a friend of hers was a very like effeminate young man. So of course he gets nominated for homecoming queen at the high school. Another one of her friends was dating a girl who had been going out with a football player. And since she broke up with him to go out with this other guy, the football team decided it was appropriate to burn a swastika into that young man's parents' front lawn in retaliation. It was the kind of town where, you know, a young person with 2 bad legs that couldn't walk would be nicknamed Gimpy and be known all over town as Gimpy. In high school, Janice actually took a class in mechanical drawing. She was the only female in that class and was relentlessly teased and bullied in that class for daring to be a woman in a mechanical drawing class. In another class she was in, during a sort of a discussion, she actually spoke out in favor of racial integration. This is the kind of thing in their town that like lots of people actually agreed with, but wouldn't say it because they didn't want to be ostracized. Now, plenty of other people, if they said it, they would get, you know, they would get arguments, they would get pushback, they would get people, you know, trying to shout them down perhaps. But in Janice's case, she had already acted out so much as a weirdo that people, instead of fighting her on it, just took it as more evidence that, you know, she's crazy. She had also taken to dressing like a beatnik as much as she could, from what she had seen in, I think it was like Time magazine or Life magazine, of a story on the beatniks. You know, instead of wearing dresses, she was wearing leggings and short skirts over the leggings and stuff. Eventually, and I don't know why anyone doesn't talk about this more, eventually Janis Joplin becomes the reason young women start wearing blue jeans everywhere. Before her, forget it. Like, I mean, don't call in and regale me with stories about how your great grandma wore dungarees to, you know, to church every Sunday or something and lived a very happy life. But by and large, women in America during these times didn't wear what would be considered men's pants or men's clothes. And that's what blue Levi's would be. And, you know, this is a time when men would be sent home from school for wearing dungarees, Levi's jeans, anything like that. They were supposed to wear slacks every goddamn day. Obviously not the same in every state, in every county, in every city in America, but in a general sense, we're still what, 20 years away from the mid 70s where guys in Aerosmith get like expelled from school for having long hair. And they're in like New England, not Texas even. I'm going to jump now to the work of one Richard Goldstein, who used to be a writer for The Village Voice in the 60s, and he wrote a book that came out in 2015 called Another Piece of My Heart, My Life of Rock and Revolution in the 60s. In the section of the book where he is discussing Janis Joplin and his interviews with her and his time sort of getting to know her, he says, Janis had the requisite rough youth in Texas. She was the town slut. The victim of the nasty collusion between sex and contempt for women who crave it. No need to go into detail about her biography. It's pretty well known. Her time in Austin, where she was part of the bohemian, I guess, music scene that seeded the San Francisco sound. Her journey west with Chet Helms, who would run one of the city's 2 major music venues. The Avalon Ballroom, her appearance at the legendary Trips Festival. We were just interested in being beatniks then, she told me. Now we've got responsibilities. I guess you could say. Ambitions. Let's go back. There's nothing before or after that statement. She was the town slut. To qualify the writer's qualifications for making that statement. Now, this book was published well after Scars of Sweet Paradise by Alice Eccles. And I want to make a pretty fine point on the fact that he doesn't say she was known as the town slut. He doesn't say she told me she was the town slut. He doesn't say she told me she was known as the town slut back home. And he didn't say people back home thought of her as the town slut. He just said she was the town slut. Similar to, I guess, the feelings of the writers of the script for The Rose, who decided to make the character of Pearl tell Houston Dyer that, she got railed by every member of the football team one night on the 50-yard line. I'm going to go back to Scars of Sweet Paradise by Alice Eccles, which again came out before the 2015 book by Goldstein. She says, what really sealed Janice's fate as a social untouchable was her growing reputation as the school slut. Hear that? Hear how much better and more informative that is? At some point in her junior year, Janice felt compelled to appear promiscuous. Among her friends, there is no consensus. Hey, look, investigative writing and journalism. Anyway, among her friends, there is no consensus on how Janice came by her new role. It may have developed because word had it that Janice was sleeping around, and she simply decided that if people wanted to call her a slut, she might as well act like one, or because Janice was tired of being ignored and threw herself into the one activity that was sure to get a poor Arthur girl talked about. Whatever the reason, Janice certainly knew it wouldn't take much to earn a bad reputation at TJ High. By her senior year, the rumors were flying that Janis Joplin read pornography and was making it with guys left and right. I assume that sentence means making it, in quotes, like having sex with, as opposed to making pornography with guys left and right. Maybe that was it too. Either way. I mean, let's see. Sorry. Threw myself off. At TJ, like so many other American high schools, quote, you could do it one time and everyone in the whole school would know and say they'd slept with you, says one of her friends named Patty. Once the kids started calling Janice a whore, Patty figured Janice might have said, oh, fuck, I'll just go ahead and do it. Other friends suspect Janice did go all the way, but not nearly as often as many other girls who simply had the sense to keep quiet about their sex lives. And yet several good friends contend that while Janice did everything in her power to suggest she was loose, she never really put out. Grant Lyons thinks, quote, it's possible Janice could have played the makeout queen without actually having intercourse, unquote. Carlene insists Janice remained a virgin until after graduation. So does her classmate and friend Terry Owens, despite the fact that to this day, quote, every guy down there says they slept with her, unquote. As for porn, Carlene says, you know what it was? Mickey Spillane novels. Mickey Spillane was a hard-boiled detective fiction writer, for context. Whether or not Janice lost her virginity in high school matters less in the end than the lengths to which she went to appear loose. How about that? Let's see. 2/3 of a page of writing. Isn't that better? Isn't that so much more satisfying? Doesn't that seem like someone who's being much less of a glory hound than the other writer? Janice, 10 years later, would talk about the kind of women or girls that were really uptight in her hometown. That she would see that, like, she would sort of see the same types all over the place in the really pricey seats at her concerts. And she'd talk about the fact that, some of these girls think they're going to like Janice when they see her, And then Janice would come out and damage and offend their femininity. She would say things, for her point of view was they were thinking, no chick is supposed to stand like that. I mean, crouching down in front of the guitar player going, letting your tits shake around and your hair is stringy and you have no makeup on and sweat running down your face and you're coming up to the fucking microphone, man. And at one point their heads go click and they go, oh no. And their expressions on their faces are of absolute horror. Those girls are going, oh my God, she may be able to sing, but she doesn't have to act like that. Those were all, by the way, if it's not clear, those are all Janice's words. Love it. Now later on, I'm skipping a bunch of stuff in the timeline here. I'm going to skip some of her folksy period, and I'm going to get into her moving to Austin, and for a little bit of character study, because this relates to her portrayal by Bette Midler in The Rose, and I think this is one of the areas where The Rose does a great job. During the Austin period, let's see, this is Alice Eccles saying this again. Janice emerged a formidable talent, and her voice was acclaimed unequivocally. Her personality, however, elicited a more ambivalent response. She could be so abrasive. Janice pretty much took no shit off anyone, remembers Ramsey Wiggins, and Dave Martinez agrees that Janice could be harsh. If she found someone boring, she didn't hesitate to cut that person off. Other people would call her, this is back to me now, I'm out of the text. I'm reading some of the quotes, though. Friends were calling her a horse's ass, a really mean person, have a lot of put-downs ready as preemptive strikes. That definitely comes across in the film, The Rose, really, really well. She's constantly firing shit off. Like there's a scene where she's just tearing through a bathhouse full of naked men, and she's talking trash about every single person she sees and their cocks. But, people's attitudes were like, yeah, you can sing, but so what? You're a weirdo. And she'd get into huge fights with people. She was very defensive and nasty and aggressive. And I don't know. It's tough to judge these things in modern day because now we've had more time to sort of look back on the history of hard to deal with women and realize that was the only way they could get anything done in a very sexist environment. So I'm not professing to be able to give you the whole picture. There's books you can read, obviously. But who would that person be in modern day? Who would that person be 100 years before then? It's anyone's guess, but there's a lot of conditions and context around what roles women were allowed to play in society that would hedge them in. So maybe people remember her as being really mean and aggressive and abrasive, but I mean, in a whole town full of drunk musicians like Austin, I mean, were there no guys that were like that either? I wonder. I don't know. I highly doubt that there weren't a lot of abrasive, angry, cutting musicians. I believe that there was probably a bunch of dumb, belligerent, drunk musicians that were men that weren't as clever as Janice and didn't cut to the bone the way her comments did. Maybe. Because if you're a guy, you can just be dumb and violent and people make excuses for it. Or you can be very intellectual and cutting in your writing, maybe, but not every woman gets to ascend to those positions where they can, I don't know. I'm not speaking on behalf of women. I'm getting out of my lane here, as I possibly have done more than once in this episode already. I want to be conscious of that because I tend to sometimes, and I say this for anyone else who's afflicted with this mental illness, I tend to sometimes venture into areas where I may not be an expert and start creating hypotheses that may or may not be true or relevant. Now, did I just cut my own legs off as the host of an informational podcast that's ongoing? Yes, I did. But rest assured, if I'm speculating, you will hear it in my voice, and I will qualify it as such. I have not, to my knowledge, up to this point, given off anything that is wholly untruth as truth because of my own opinion or my own bias. I'm reading from other people's books, watching lots of documentaries, and trying to put it all together. Back to Janice. Besides her popularization of the blue jeans on women, other people would like to give her responsibility and credit for the explosion of the use of the word fuck, especially on stage, especially when it comes to women being able to say it. Maybe not so much in her time, but later. One of her friends, Ramsey Wiggins, says, Janice got us all peppering our conversations with far fucking out. In fucking credible. Big fucking deal. I suspect she was no less successful in spreading that habit in San Francisco. During her time in Austin, Texas, which is with a folk music crowd, by the way, like a blues and folk and Americana, bluegrassy kind of crowd of folks, she and her friends got a reputation for being loud and obnoxious, getting in lots of fights, having lots of sex, and as soon as they walked past people in bars or restaurants, at that time it was socially acceptable just to start yelling things at people that offended you with their looks. I mean, this is an era where, I mean, if you're a man with long hair or a woman that's not dressed properly, it was completely okay in American society for a complete stranger and a group of complete strangers to start insulting you and shouting at you. I may have said this on another podcast. I don't know. In the mid 1990s, up here in the supposedly advanced and progressive, socially aware, Pacific Northwest. I got yelled at, screamed at by a complete stranger for having long hair. Someone screamed, "Get that fucking haircut!" out of their house as I was walking through a neighborhood. I was not protesting or picketing. Anyways, just to put that little detail in there. So what I'm saying is, imagine how much worse it was in the mid 1960s, early 1960s in Texas in America. And you're walking around with a group of people that polite society decides you need to be taken down a peg for walking around in daylight wearing, hippie clothes or looking like beatniks or whatever. So people would harass them, customers that they, in restaurants and bars. And instead of ignoring them, Janice was more likely just to go, "Fuck you, I ain't scared of you." And then they would leave her alone. Janice said, "A lot of people challenge you once to see if you got the balls to look like that. And if you go, 'Oh, I'm sorry,' you're shot down already." Now, even when she'd travel off to San Francisco and end up, with Big Brother and the holding company, and was trying to sort of absorb herself into that environment, that, social happening and the look and the vibe and the feel and kind of take it all in, she was out of step already, even though she was the most bohemian person she knew from Texas, or a lot of people knew from Texas. Up there, it was, there was a girl or two that became friends with her that was just like, "Hey, let's not just do the jeans all the time, lace and feathers and beads and, other kinds of hats and stuff like that." And she got super into it. She started kind of finding her visual style all over again in a totally new way. I want to jump into a bunch of different sources now and get into the sort of San Francisco era. There's an interesting little chunk of history from Rock of Ages, The Rolling Stone History of Rock and Roll by Edward Jeffrey Stokes and Ken Tucker. I believe this middle section is the Jeffrey Stokes section. But they're talking about, there's like these 4 bands that are all kind of on the same level at the time in the San Francisco community. That there were Big Brother, The Airplane, which would become Jefferson Airplane, The Great Society, and The Charlatans. Now, there was a huge change when Chet Helms brings his old Texas buddy Janis Joplin up to California to join Big Brother. And Signe Tolley Anderson decided that her new baby made it impossible for her to stay with The Airplane and was replaced by The Great Society's Grace Slick. Sound familiar? So when Grace Slick leaves the band The Great Society, they fold up. And then Airplane and Big Brother are like 2 bands with 2 brand new female singers and starting to attract a lot more attention. And there was still, but this is on a local level. Like this is 66 or so. And a lot of that environment was sort of self-made and unprofessional by design. People were feeling these things out. They were feeling out what it was to put a band together instead of having someone put it together for you or put a backing band together around a singer. They were also living together. They were having sex with lots of different people, practicing anything but the straight life, non-monogamy, non-binary sexuality, organizing things themselves for, political reasons or business reasons and supporting businesses that their friends were starting. Friends were their managers. Friends were their people that made the posters for their shows, helped them make their clothes in some cases. Their drugs, of course, you had to get them from friends. You can't just go to the store and get them. But it's a community, and it's a community that's figuring itself out as it goes along. There's other notes in the same book a little further down the line about, what happens when San Francisco bands start getting signed. Not all of them did well with the signings right away. They point out Big Brother and the holding company were breaking up with their manager, Chet Helms, and with no hard feelings, but he couldn't handle both a band and the Avalon, which was, I think it was a big club actually. But Helms had arranged for them to audition with Mainstream Records, which was based out of Chicago, and they didn't have a lot of money, and they didn't have a great track record. But the band, really wanted to get to recording. They wanted to get something down on vinyl. And this would lead them to getting a deal with Columbia. In retrospect, one of the band members would note that before Janis joined, they had one person who was the best looking guy in the band. And they had another person who was sort of like the more mysterious leader type. And when Janis joined, she became both. So like the heart and soul and the appeal of the band sort of shifted over to all the focus on her from the outside, which they hadn't really been prepared for. And hearing them talk about it well after the fact is definitely interesting and valuable, because they had sort of built this thing up themselves, ended up with a great new singer, and had to try to keep this whole thing a democracy while she's taking off and getting a lot of attention. And their own manager is going to want to sort of break her off himself. I mean, sorry, I don't mean that in a sexual way. Break her off for his own management, personal, focal as the focal point in his management career, and get her more success away from them, because she is kind of bigger than all of them. She is kind of more exciting to the public than all of them. They don't particularly like when they come around to the same places they used to play, and instead of Big Brother and the Holding Company, it says Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin. And then the next time they come, it says Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. Doesn't feel good for them, and understandable, especially when you're in your early 20s and, doing lots of drugs. That's not a good headspace to be in for something like that. But it's reality, and if they were all so equal, and also if they were all bringing something equal to the table, then I don't know, maybe in my cynical mind as a grown up now, I don't know why they couldn't have just kept on going and been big without her then, with another singer, right? No, it's clear that she was a boon to them. And like I said before, unless you are like tripping out of your gourd at one of these really cool San Francisco ballroom shows with like the psychedelic lights going on and everyone around you is just an amazing source of energy, I don't know how I would sit through a whole set of Big Brother and the Holding Company live. It's not meant. I mean, hearing it today, it doesn't translate as well, song-wise and attention span-wise. Obviously, they've got some amazing songs that are concise and to the point and come off really, really well. But a whole live set, there could be a lot of droning. There could be a lot of male voices instead of female voices being predominant in the, in the mix. I don't know. And also a lot of spazzy drumming, a lot of tons and tons of fills, a lot of fast-paced stuff. And I think the Cosmic Blues Band that she was in later suited her voice more, but the Full Tilt Boogie Band, what she ended up with at the end of her life, was probably the best example of what really suited her. More energy in the performances, a little more rock and roll, and not so soft and not so easy, but also not as cluttered as Big Brother and the Holding Company when it comes to the amount of noises that are fighting your ear for attention at the same time. Around the time she joins the band, she also sits down in the front row for an Otis Redding concert in San Francisco and absorbs everything he does. She absorbs a lot of the rhythms, a lot of the pacing, a lot of the urgency of his voice and the percussiveness, the gotcha, 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 gotcha stuff. She would do that in her songs after that. She made a conscious shift away from her folk and blues only singing approach to be more up-tempo and more urgent, would create more urgency in the song using her voice. She found she had the power to do that. Not a lot of band leaders and singers do. Not a lot of bands react well to that, but hers did. I would say the Doors did that too, but usually they were pushing Jim. That's a conversation for another episode, obviously, but a lot of times he could urge them on and make them go faster and louder. Once she started hanging out with bands like the Quicksilver Messenger Service and the Grateful Dead, she started dating, I guess, as the word. I don't know what it is in the 60s in San Francisco when you just sort of fall in with somebody and start having sex all the time and living with them. But she started seeing Pigpen from the Grateful Dead. And Bob Weir would say that they always could hear them having sex because Janis was very loud. Oh, daddy, 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 all of the time. And it was hard to fall asleep when they were going at it. So So they just worked around that schedule. Let's see. Oh, there's a white blues artist named, I've never heard of him, named Nick Gravenites, something like that. Don't know who he is, as I said, but he was quoted in a biography of Janis Joplin written by Myra Friedman, saying of Big Brother and the holding company, they were just too freaky. This chick had this hair hanging down, and she was dressed in this bedspread, and the jewelry, chicken bones, voodoo shit, and this patchouli perfume reeking. Her complexion was a wipeout. She had a sore throat, and she was screeching like a wounded owl. I didn't really like the sound, but I was impressed. They were aliens, and they were sticking it out. That was from one of their earlier performances around 1967. But before that, actually, I've just got to jump to one little tiny anecdote because I have this book called Becoming Electra, the true story of Jack Holzman's missionary record label by Mick Houghton. And of course I got it because I'm working on some Doors stuff. But I had to look and see if Janis was mentioned. And, in passing, she's mentioned once or twice as compared to some other people. But on one page, they say this. I'm not going to go into detail about who all these people are that you're about to hear about, other than two very important ones. These are associates of Stefan Grossman and Paul Rothschild, and they're talking about getting some kind of a band together. Rory and I, it says, had recorded with some singers up front. Rory and I had broken up, and I was in Berkeley living with Steve Mann, and we played a lot of guitar together. Jorma Kaukonen from Jefferson Airplane was very influenced by Steve. From his tune, Fate of Man is about Steve. So the idea evolved to have Steve and me playing guitars, and Paul Rothschild, working for Elektra Records and producing and stuff, set up an informal rehearsal at our place. They arranged for Taj Mahal and Janis Joplin to come in as vocalists. Jesus Christ! Can you imagine? The sound of the four of us was as powerful as you can imagine. The combination of Janis's rough voice and the smooth voice of Taj Mahal was amazing. We left it that Paul and Jack would set us up in LA, where we'd rehearse with a studio bass and drummer. A few weeks later, I headed back to New York to check in with Paul and see how things were progressing, and he said it wasn't going to happen, as Paul and Janis had taken off in their own solo directions. Janis Joplin joined Big Brother and the holding company in June 1996, while a chance meeting with Ed Sanders in the Village resulted in Grossman joining the Fugs for 4 months at the end of that summer. I want to jump back now to the book Scars of Sweet Paradise. It's Paradise by Alice Eccles. There's so much good information here, I kind of have to just read directly from the book for a little bit. We're going back to July 1966, a month after Janis comes back to San Francisco after being away for a little bit, but the band members from Big Brother and the holding company have moved to Lagunitas, just across the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge in Marin County, and they're all sharing a house there. Nearby is the Grateful Dead and Quicksilver Messenger Service. It was the hippie version of getting a little money and going to the suburbs, Sam recalls. In Lagunitas, there was no nightlife to compete with rehearsals. Big Brother practiced diligently and talked constantly about music and everything else. Sam remembers going on for hours into the night, every night, about God and the universe, a favorite phrase of hers, and about how to bring the essence of the blues into what we were playing without being purists, and yet without diluting the power of that beautiful music. We talked about what a different drum beat would do here or a guitar chord there. Janis was always in the thick of these discussions. If there was any telling what to do, it would be coming from Janis, says Sam. But we were in it together. She was delighted with our discoveries, and so were we. They developed this sort of tribal following of like friends and quasi-family that would come out to the Avalon Ballroom whenever they would play, and other musicians, of course, too, and other fans of those musicians. There was even a small contingent of little children or toddlers or babies around. In one case, Jimi Hendrix would babysat one of their friends' children backstage at the Winterland Ballroom the whole night. From the time he was a baby, the child's name was Hongo. Hongo's hair was white and in an afro. Jimi Hendrix would see my son and just flip out. He loved that afro. That night, he stayed with Hongo the whole time. Also during this time, the whole band is picking up speed shooting it straight into their veins. They would eventually, Janice and her other associates would eventually move from shooting up speed to shooting up mescaline and shooting up heroin as well. I mean, Janice was on and off with heroin for a large part of her, adulthood. I mean, by the time she got to Woodstock in 1969, she'd already had one life-threatening overdose. Janice liked shooting up other people too. She was apparently a maniac with needles, and she liked the thrill of hitting somebody and tapping the vein and getting them high that way. She would fight sometimes over who gets to pop somebody. It's like popping pimples. Some people have an obsession with popping other people's pimples and stuff. Also close to around this time that the photographer named Bob Seidemann had a session with her, and this became a very famous poster of her nude, just wearing beads. And I'll read some stuff straight from him. He thought she was an asshole who was really aggressive and abrasive and annoying. He bragged, though, that he was the one that made her the first hippie pinup girl. She was posing naked from the waist up, and he draped a velvet cape over her and was like artfully arranging beads and things across her chest and leaving one nipple visible for the shot. And as soon as he was telling her he was done taking photos, she said, "Oh, motherfucker, I want to take my fucking clothes off." She takes them all off, and she rearranges the beads herself and has her shoot more pictures. And several days later, she goes to a store on Haight Street where, for this photographer, has his contact sheets there. "Do I look that good?" he claims she asked him. The collective answer of everyone in the store was no, according to Seidemann. He really doesn't like her, apparently. But later on, she would chase him down and berate him because she didn't get any money from the sales of the nude poster of her. "You motherfucker, you're taking all my money I'm making for you," she yelled at him. She was a pain in the ass, he concludes. All right, well, I don't know. Sounds kind of reasonable. If you're selling pictures of her naked. Playboy pays people to as if anyone reads Playboy anymore, but you know what I mean. Playboy, yes, they made a lot of people a lot of money by publishing the nude photos of those women, but those women also got paid for their time, as far as I know, especially the celebrities, which Janice was. So later that same year, after being engaged to a guy named Michael, it gets broken off, and she finds herself being the only single gal among her female friends, and it's bumming her out. And she was still in touch with the guy, but, knew she was never going to marry him. And in fact, that summer finally learned, to quote the book, exactly what her fiancé had been doing during their engagement. At Michael's suggestion, Debbie decided to look Janice up on a trip to San Francisco. The two women arranged to meet at the Avalon the night of a Big Brother gig. "I went backstage," Debbie recalls. "Janice had a bottle of Southern Comfort, and we started to get into a girl-to-girl talk. We were starting to realize that things with Michael were a little bit different than we thought. We'd sort of known what was going on, but hadn't copped to it exactly. The guys in the band kept interrupting, so Janice and Debbie locked themselves in the bathroom with the Southern Comfort and began comparing notes. The more we found out, the more we laughed. He'd done things like sending us both a dozen roses with the same message on the same day. We were in hysterics. We knew Michael was a tricky kind of guy, but..." Janice didn't seem heartbroken, Debbie says. "What are you going to do? You're either going to cry, get angry, or laugh. And since we really liked each other, our first response was to laugh. It was as if we had a sisters against that creature kind of bond." During this whole time, she never had any heterosexual relationship with a man that lasted long enough for him to really be integrated into the Big Brother family of friends. So, for example, before she moved to Marin County, she had been sharing an apartment with a guy named Travis Rivers, who I guess was the one that Chet Helms had sent to Austin, Texas to sort of fetch her and bring her up to San Francisco the first time. They didn't start off great. He got her up there and then confessed that he had nowhere to stay, and therefore she had nowhere to stay. But he had some money, so he rented a room in a Pine Street house, and they started living there for a few weeks. And she came home and found him with a group of people that were shooting up mescaline, as I mentioned earlier, and she kind of freaked out on him. He had to talk her down and explain that it wasn't speed and it wasn't heroin. But she still didn't at that time, she didn't like needles or drugs being around people that doing drugs with needles, because she knew she was susceptible to really getting back into it. So obviously the timeline here is pretty scrunched. Clearly she was into doing drugs with needles. So, but during the time with this guy, Travis, she was trying to stay off of it. The next day after that argument, he asks her to marry him, and she turns him down right away and didn't put up a fight, which drove Janis bonkers because, number one, it made her think that, well, clearly he wasn't serious if I could just turn him down and he didn't even argue or, explain himself. That pissed her off. And she said, if you really loved me, you'd want to know why. She started crying and told him she was going to be big, really, really big. And this would be the only time in her life that she'd be able to have any boy she wanted and didn't intend to lose the opportunity. This whole tirade was designed to provoke him. And then he failed to react to that. And she storms out of the apartment screaming at him, after I've said something like that to you, you'd have to beat me up if you really love me. So she moves to Lagunitas with the band, and they wouldn't talk for quite a few months after that. Around springtime of 1967, Janis would start seeing Country Joe McDonald, Country Joe and the Fish, who was, a very politically active, a musician and activist. If you have never seen Woodstock, the film, but you've seen, let's say, compilations of clips from it, I would say, the stuff that used to be on MTV back in the day in 1994 when they were promoting the new Woodstock. But I'm sure most people listening to this haven't necessarily. You don't remember that little montage. Or other promotional materials for Woodstock or retrospectives. You always see this guy in an army jacket. I think he was wearing at the time, and getting the crowd to spell F-U-C-K. I saw that one as a teenager, and I didn't know. I saw the film, got it from the library. I didn't realize that the hippies said swear words. I thought that my generation was responsible for everything that was bad in the world and vulgar, and that the word fuck must have come along somewhere in the 80s. But he's the one singing, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. My next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Oh, ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. The Fixin' to Die rag by Country Joe McDonald and the Fish. He was much more active politically than she was. They were both very focused on their bands, and to hear him tell it, they never had a proper love affair. Good friendship. He said there was a loving maternal side of her that was never allowed to grow, and they were both control freaks in ways that wouldn't really allow them to be vulnerable enough to have a proper romantic relationship that was going to last. Going off my notes here, I've been going several days in a row. I feel like I talked about that bit already, and if I did, you can ask for your money back at the front desk. But although she was not overtly political in her lyrics or the speeches she was giving on stage, everybody else was doing it, so it's not like anyone was wanting for more of that kind of thing. And I'm sure it didn't feel natural to her to try to take that on. But she did accomplish the main quest of her life, which was to make her values, fit in her life and to project and communicate values that mattered most to her and exemplify them. A lot of that was freedom. A lot of that was liberation. A lot of that was self-expression for its own sake and not having to bow down to anybody and not having to make excuses to anybody else for what you wanted to be. Now, when it comes to the various impressions of people who slept with Janis Joplin, there's a bit of consensus there on the basics. One person, Bob Seidemann, who didn't like her but still had sex with her, said the first time we had sex, it was sort of like alligator wrestling. She was insatiable. Someone else named Stanley Mouse said she would, he was attracted to the way she would light up when she came backstage to hobnob with the bands between sets. He said she was very passionate the night they slept together, but her carrying on seemed excessive, and he wondered if she was able to stop and actually enjoy herself. By many accounts, I guess there were usually theatrical qualities to her lovemaking, and she told a reporter in 1970, I asked the guys I was bawling, do I bawl like I sing? Is it really me, or am I putting on a show? A one-time roommate friend of hers said she would usually stay up laughing at how loud and how quick the lovemaking on the other side of the wall was when Janice had somebody over. Definitely felt like Janice was being a performer. Another friend of hers said Janice really knew her way around a mattress. Another good quote, not sexual in nature, describes her as one side, pure tomboy, a tough, scrappy bitch, unwilling to take crap off of anybody. And the other side, just China doll fragile, a person living in fear of any further hurt. I took a little break today before recording this and went back to watch more footage of her in the studio with Big Brother. And man, even when she's singing quietly, it's heartbreaking to listen to. And I realized there's a lot of parallels with her and Andrew Wood of Mother Love Bone. And if you haven't heard that episode, it's there for you if you want it. But, you know, the uncomfortable home life with the parents and the trying to sort of make people love them through performance and the needles, the heroin use, the heroin overdose, the lyrics that convey some confusion about feelings and the desire to be understood and the desire to be healed and the desire, you know, to bring people into your world and let them see who you are as a person, and the vulnerability mixed with the cleverness and the one-liners and the desire to be kind of a comedian of sorts as a lead singer in a band, and also the desire to like break out of your established band that got you famous and do some solo things. I mean, it's all Andy Wood and it's all Janis Joplin. It's fascinating to me what kindred spirits they seem like. Not just the circumstances they grew up in and for the circumstances of the life that they created for themselves, but their personas, their personalities, their lyrics, and their approach to performing on stage. Not being an equal member of a band when they're being most effective. When they're being most effective, the band is providing them with a platform and being more almost evangelical about the power of love in their music, their particular kind of music. Oof. It's a lot to take sometimes. Though Andy Wood still, you know, he would always have full support from his mom and a very deep emotional connection with his mom, even though his family was kind of jagged and sort of a tumultuous wraparound of his sensitive life. Janice did not have that with her mom, let alone her family in general. She wrote them a lot of letters wherever she went and whatever she was doing, explaining where she was and how the band was going and how she felt about things and the perception of her getting bigger and bigger and bigger, some of her hopes and fears and desires to come home and, you know, show everybody how well she was doing when she came back to visit. Like, you really don't get the feeling that this is a daughter writing to two parents that really do not like the fact that she's singing in a rock and roll band and just want her to stop and come home and do a boring lady thing. Do a boring lady, respectable adult thing with the rest of your life, please. When are you going to be done with this horrible tragedy? At one point, she did have her family visit, you know, her up in San Francisco, and she showed them around all the local haunts that people knew her at. Took them into the Avalon Ballroom, you know, and just to sort of present it as like, look at this wonderful place that I get to sing at, and I get to be, you know, the sort of master of ceremonies of this band I'm in, and people come, this place fills up with, and they just didn't get it. She said, isn't it wonderful? And they just, it's like she just was perplexed that they couldn't see how good all of this was. And they just sort of took it as, well, I guess there's really no hope. She's so successful in her own mind in a way that she doesn't understand, doesn't jive with reality, and we just have to give up now. An associate of Janice's would also meet her family backstage at a gig in Houston when she was on tour, near, closer to where her family lived. And he says, his name is James Gurley, and he says they were just appalled at everything they were seeing. And it's not an age thing as much as it is a values thing, I guess. It doesn't have to be that way, It's about upbringing, and it's about perception and reality. I mean, I know that like Alice Cooper at the peak of his like Welcome to My Nightmare era in whatever it was, the mid to late 70s, said, he had Groucho Marx backstage watching what he was doing, and like Bette Davis, I believe. And they just, they were used to all kinds of wacky stage theatrics, and they thought it was great. They thought it was, right up their alley, being just like typical. Like, yeah, this is good entertainment. Yeah, what you're doing here is great. Yeah, this, it's like they've lived through vaudeville. They know. Maybe it wasn't Bette Davis. Maybe it was a female performer that was hanging out with Groucho Marx that day. I'm not going to go put on that one digital video versatile disc of the Time Life collection of the history of rock and roll to find that one scene to remember what Alice Cooper said. But my point is, if you get show business, it doesn't matter what your age or your generation is. It matters that you come from this really isolated place in Texas where things are very repressive, and no one understands why anyone wouldn't want to immediately settle down and have 7 kids there and be quiet and meek. Why would you want to go off and become Janis Joplin? As I'm getting toward the end of Janis's life, with a whole bunch more notes that kind of bounce around the timeline to go through, I want to finish up my thoughts on The Rose before I get to the real stuff. Because there's a few more scenes in that I want to bring up without taking you through it minute by minute. But I think they're worth mentioning. There's a concert scene and then straight into a backstage meet and greet with a bunch of important people. And this is after the chauffeur has been brought along as her lover and her associate and her caretaker and stuff. And he tries to get in the way and tries to protect her. And of course, the cranky British manager, puts him in his place and says, we have a relationship and this is a business and you don't get in the way. Your place is somewhere else. And she's just nonstop shaking hands and hugging people and telling them how great they are and them telling her how great she is. And he's being introduced to business people and advertising people and press people. And it reminds me of something Eddie Vedder said. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, back in 92, he was discussing something very similar happening to him at the album release party for 10, the first Pearl Jam record with Sony Epic Records. And he said, you work so hard to create your own thing. I'm paraphrasing him right now. Basically it was like, you're creative and you're a sensitive person and you work really hard with your band to do something. And you get to make a record and then you're trucked in front of all these people. and the folks that signed you to the record label are just like, hey, this is Richard. He works in the marketing department and he's the reason your record's out there. Don't you ever forget it. And this is Tracy, and she makes sure that your album, goes to the stores and is always in stock. When you see those in stores, you better thank her. When you're a big rock star, don't forget Lenny. He makes it all happen for you because he owed me a favor and he, does what I say, blah, 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 blah. Again, it's weird for this film to do it 30 seconds after someone comes off the stage, right? It seems like the kind of thing that you would let your artist drink some water or whatever and get a massage first. But, because this is 79, because it's not supposed to be 69. Or is it? I can't tell. This movie doesn't tell us. it wants to have it both ways. It wants to portray things in what would have been then the modern era when it comes to the, the way people dress and stuff. And it's still, I don't know, there's still elements of it where they want you to think this is the 60s, but they won't really own up to it. There's a scene where an old girlfriend of Bette Midler's character shows up, and Janice had multiple girlfriends during her adult life, and she would have them tour with her a little bit or show up at a particular gig backstage and spend the night with them. And in this film, it's portrayed a little strangely. Like not sexually strangely, but the first thoughts that I had was, the girlfriend shows up and it's not really earned. Like, we don't have a precedent for this person, like what they mean to her. But then again, I guess that's sort of the ongoing thing with this movie. People coming in and out of her life very suddenly and very passionately. And then old Houston Dyer has to go and lash out physically and show that he's just as awful as every other man in the world is. After she had talked him up like he was something special, he gets angry and jealous that he sees her with her old girlfriend being affectionate. He was supposed to be the only good one of us. I don't really take it like that in my heart. That was my fragile male ego knee-jerk reaction. In reality, I've defended too many songs and films by saying, look, the one portrayal of one woman is not an indictment of all womanhood. People know real people that behave like this, that they wrote about. So I will keep my ego in check, my fragile male ego in check, and try not to be disingenuous about this. But if you were judgmental and quick to defend your sex's honor, you might think, well, they're making all men look bad. I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think it shows that his character is not a great guy if he's gonna. But it also, I think, was their attempt to show that she's an infuriating person that is very inconsistent, and around her anything can happen. And if you have a fragile ego, it's going to be a problem for you. Of course, they get in like some kind of a half of a fist fight, or half a fist fight in the duration. Not that hitting a woman is not a fist fight and a woman hitting you back is not a fist fight in this movie. But, of course, he comes back later to be with her towards the end of the movie, right before she dies. Spoiler alert. Of course, she's going to die. Throughout this movie, my reactions would swerve wildly from it feeling like a cautionary tale, like a made-for-TV movie or an after-school special. Do you know what that is? And one of the best films I've seen in ages. And I mean that. Like, there's so many elements of this film that are fantastic and well executed and compared to all the awful, awful stuff I've seen in the last 10 years come out of mainstream Hollywood. But I say that as someone that had no reason to like it from the first place. I assumed this was a hit piece on Janis Joplin, and I was ready to hate it when I saw it. I don't entirely hate it. I love a lot of it, but my issue with the portrayal of her on film is not that she didn't act this random, as portrayed by Bette Midler, that she didn't act this desperate, or that she didn't act this violent, or that she didn't act in ways that would confuse and frustrate all the people around her at any given second. There seems to be plenty of stories to back that up with Janis Joplin's behavior. But choosing to compress so much of that behavior into a small narrative of like a week or two's time, and to neglect the backstory of this person, and neglect to show them in their quiet moments, coming up with songs or titles or arrangements, working hard on their craft, building a rapport with their band members, being introspective and thoughtful. That is a crime to me, and it should be a crime to any creative person living that sees this film. Also, with more reading since I started recording this episode, Paul Rothchild was like a very important producer in Janis Joplin's life. Paul Rothchild, of course, worked with the Doors as well as her. And it was said that he could learn how to talk to anybody. If he could find a key to a particular musician's language, he could describe what wasn't happening that needed to happen, as in their performance in the studio. How to communicate that, how to communicate to a very sensitive and emotionally overblown person that thinks that is giving their all, but doesn't know how to like process what you're saying to them and the directions you're giving them all the time. He was the kind of person that knew how to communicate with musicians and creative types to get what he wanted out of a studio performance. By the time Janis worked with him, she had 3 albums worth of studio time, but never a producer who taught her the difference between singing in the studio and singing on stage in a stage performance. Every other musician in that situation gets forced to learn what that is. They put dampeners on the drums that aren't there live, so you're not as loud and ringy. They change the settings on your amplifier so it's not as distorted. They have you change the way you play the bass, so it's works more with the dynamics of the song. A lot of times, more high intensity in certain parts and less intensity in other parts than you would when you're full of adrenaline on stage and just blowing everything out, especially for lead singers. It's a crime, I just use the word again, for her to have gotten to that point in her career and only had one producer, the one at the end of her life, to understand how to communicate that to her and help her pace herself and sing for the studio. And it's also a crime that that's the guy that was responsible for this horrible, horrible cheeseball rock music on the soundtrack of The Rose. Fuck you, Paul Rothchild. You don't get away. You don't get away with it. You don't get away with being that un-rock and roll, even after you produce The Doors and a bunch of other people. Damn it, Paul. There's a lot of fun footage of Janis being interviewed at various times by Dick Cavett, and they have a great rapport and a great sort of sense of comedic timing between the two of them. He himself says that they were very close and they were very friendly, and if they ever did get intimate together, he can't remember because it was a long time ago and his memory is not what it used to be. But he smiles and he looks down when he says it. There's a great one where I think she had just done Monterey Pop. And by the way, if you need a fix of Janis, go watch Ball and Chain from Monterey Pop. I think it's also a waste that they did. It wasn't Light as Fast as the Sound. They recorded 2 songs from Big Brother that day, and one was Ball and Chain, which is amazing, and the other one is the combination of the two. Ugh. Sorry, I'm not a fan. What a waste. Anyways, she goes on Dick Cavett, and she's still only like 24 years old. She looks like your fun aunt, and she looks young and sort of weird and fragile and cherubic at the same time. I don't know what it is about her, but after they blew everyone away at the Monterey Pop Festival in '67, everybody wanted a piece, and she got to do these talk shows, and the Dick Cavett stuff's great. You see people, you see him saying things to her like, "Oh, I wore my hip jacket for you," and it's just a plaid, like white and greenish kind of jacket, and she goes, "You did? Are you sure?" There's another one later on in her career. It's like 1970. So it's, a few years after that. She talked about how she's going back to Port Arthur, Texas for her 10th high school graduation. She's so excited to announce it on like live television. Her brother says that when she did come back, her parents treated her pretty cold. And so did her old friends from town. And there was like news people following her around. Cameras were like local news cameras following her from place to place. And they interview her at the reunion. And she slowly sort of backs off on her confrontational attitude and gets a little quieter and meek and more thoughtful and less boisterous. Very possible that, maybe she was she was high and it was making things hit her really hard. It was supposed to be a triumphant situation, and it just wasn't. It was just uncomfortable. Didn't make anyone's day. Didn't make anybody's weekend. Didn't make anybody happy. And we're talking about a woman who, in 1964, she was just singing folk songs with a bunch of beatniks. Not rock and roll in the least, really, compared to where she was going to go. She looked like Reagan. And I don't mean the B-movie actor that became president of the United States for 8 years. I mean Reagan from The Exorcist. Not in a gross, horrific way, but the hair and the clothes she's wearing. She looks like she's a couple of pictures I've seen at that time. She looks like she's wearing a kid's nightie. Like it's way up on her neck and kind of doily-ish or soft white kind of. I'm sure, and the same haircut and the same sort of pockmarked face. A person that their strength was in, their voice they were projecting, but not in the way they projected themselves physically at all or visually at all. This is a woman who was the first person to go on stage in front of audiences so huge and talk openly about being a woman, raw, just in front of a rock audience, to tell women they shouldn't be ashamed or feel less than a man. But she was also a person who Sam Andrew from Big Brother, as we've quoted many times in this episode, said she'd give her time to second-rate people if they'd love her. I once heard Mick Garris on his podcast talk about meeting her when he was in high school. He was a journalist for his newspaper in high school. And he got to go interview musicians. He got to interview Jimi Hendrix, for crying out loud, and Janis Joplin backstage at a festival of some kind they were playing. And he said Janice was drunk and falling all over him, a teenage kid, just going, I got nobody to love, and I ain't got no man, and the only man I got is my band man, and, really sad and really, out of control, bummed him out. Her close friend Myra would tell her, this whole thing is killing you. If you don't quit the business, you're going to die. And it would just lead Janice to cry uncontrollably and say, I don't have anything else. As Alex Eccles notes, there were no counseling programs for this. There was no, especially for like a woman addicted to drugs. And the idea of walking away from her whole profession as an unmarried 27-year-old female with a career. How do you do that? How do you do that back then? In 1970, if you're not married and you're 27 and you stop working, who's going to take care of you? That's all that support dries up. If you're not making people happy on behalf of a management company and a record label, the money goes away. Even if they owe it to you, they'll keep it. And at the end of her life, she was really getting it. She was getting after it, and she was feeling empowered in a way she hadn't been before with her band. The thing is, with Big Brother in San Francisco, they were another San Francisco band. They were a band that didn't do much on stage because in San Francisco, they had low lighting in the ballrooms and they had a psychedelic light show being projected around in most cases. They didn't have bright lights. When this band would go tour and go to like Chicago or New York, a lot of San Francisco bands were put off by the bright lights at most venues. And most audiences around the country were put off by the fact that the San Francisco bands didn't do shit on stage as far as moving around or projecting anything physically, even though they were just concentrated on their playing. Cosmic Blues Band was, as we've talked about, not an ideal situation for her personally or professionally. She couldn't run that band. She couldn't really, and they did a fine job of backing her up for what it was worth. But it was really the Full Tilt Boogie Band where she had the right energy with the right people around her, and their bassist said, she called him up to get back into her, into her space and go on tour again with her, and she was bubbly. She was happy. She was feeling powerful. And she wanted things to be good for everybody, not just her. That's the thing that doesn't come across in, obviously, the film depictions that we're talking about today. And he talks about how at this level of her ascendancy as a front woman, front person in a band that was really behind her and really energetic, unlike the Cosmic Blues Band, but also all about her, all about bringing out the best in her, unlike Big Brother and the Holding Company. She knew how to give them signals. And she said, when I change things in the middle of the song, they go with it. Like, they get it. Like, this goes hand in hand with what we're saying about not knowing that you're supposed to sing differently on stage than you're supposed to sing in the studio. She didn't know until she was 27 that she could actually be in a live situation where the band members that were supporting her could take signals from her on stage, like they would if they were working for James Brown or lots of other singers and dancers. She's like, if I do the windmill with my arm, that swinging motion that you just do a circular swinging motion, keep it going, meaning keep the same intensity. Stay on that part. Don't change the part you're in right now. Like, don't go to the bridge. Don't go to a solo. Don't go to, if we're in a chorus, stay in the chorus part. If we're in a verse, you keep playing the verse until I release you, essentially. And, when she was feeling ready to give it to the crowd in like some sort of one of her sort of soliloquies or speeches. By the way, I have to correct myself. I realize now that earlier I mentioned Tell Mama, the live recording where she gives her spiel about being a Capricorn and taking her man back who's been away. I had mashed that up in my head with Cry Baby, which is the one where she talks about being a Capricorn and her man's got to go figure himself out and go somewhere in New York or Casablanca or somewhere. Tell Mama's the one where you're like, you're just getting yourself together. You're 17, man, and you're going to find a woman. Basically, let that be me. To get back to my mention of her signals, when she wants to have one of those conversations with the crowd, she figured it out. She's just like it. She brings her hands sort of palm down and flat at her sides, and she's the band can see she's going like, bring it down, but also don't change the part of the song necessarily, just vamp for a while. She had been used to having the crowd in the palm of her hand, but with this band, she could communicate a lot more effectively with the audience. And they had a show at the Royal Albert Hall in England, which is a famous, famous venue. Cream recorded an album there. Led Zeppelin had a very famous series of shows there that I think the film is on the How the West Was Won DVD set. It's a big deal to play there and fill it up. And it was a big deal that Bob Dylan had been there before her and filled it up. And for her, the huge victory was that she got people out of their seats, these British people out of their seats, to dance. And then she went down and danced with them. And there's photos of it. It's fantastic. It looks like a lot of fun. And she's clearly overjoyed. And she's mingling with them and she's talking to them after the band is done and she's signing autographs and she must just be in heaven. But then when that all ended, she would shoot up. And that was a fairly regular thing for her towards the end. She wouldn't get high on heroin before a show. She'd be drinking and doing other stuff. But afterwards, she'd just feel that she'd hit that brick wall that people sometimes do when the show's over. I mean, it's not specific to musicians either. It's all kinds of performers. They're all kinds of social people. It can be after a night out with lots of friends, and then you get home and you're not going to fall asleep for 3 more hours and you don't know what to do with yourself emotionally, and you can't handle that coming down feeling, that drop. You're still wired. And evidently, that was sort of a thing she would do on the regular. And she did it, of course, the day she died. That was what killed her, was doing heroin alone by herself, and nobody showed up to catch her this time. She was just down the street from where the Full Tilt Boogie Band was recording. She had this sort of tryst worked out with her boyfriend and her girlfriend. They were going to all get together that day or that weekend, whatever it was, and it just didn't work out. So she had this unplanned time for not having a threesome, but being alone that she didn't plan on. Even though she was close by where the band was working, she was still left to sort of her own devices for too long in a quiet hotel room. So she ends up calling a dealer that knows her very well, that she knows very well, someone she trusts. And he shows up with heroin that is 50% pure. She'd been pretty clean for a while, having not been on the road and being surrounded by friends and things and kind of keeping needles out of her system for a little while. But according to some folks in a documentary, I don't claim to be an expert, but according to the usual wisdom, heroin in the streets is usually diluted to be only maybe 3 to 5% potent. And this is 50% because of someone's mistake, evidently. And the threesome she was going to have wasn't with like two randos. It was with Seth, her fiance, Seth Morgan, and one of her closest on and off again sort of girlfriends, Peggy Caserta. I mean, Peggy was there with her backstage shooting up at Woodstock, for crying out loud. Interesting to note, the footage from Woodstock it's a little disconcerting. You can see the discomfort when she takes the stage and starts talking to the audience. She's very meek at first, and the band kicks in and she gets into it, but she's got none of her low screaming voice. She's got her belting it out voice, and that's all that there is. And she tries to do a lot of the normal stuff she does, like half of her vocals have that, like, I can't do it. I'm not trying to pretend I can do it, but I'm just trying to make the noise that she plays in a lot. And she has a lot of notes in that range, and she had nothing. There's like no gas there. Like her vocal cords won't work for her. And you hear her in the middle of an attempt going, oh, like that, kind of half off mic, pulling her head away from the mic in frustration. She had just shot up in the honey bucket, the portable bathroom, right by the stage. And it's fair to note that Woodstock was everyone's worst show. And one of the most recorded shows of that 2-3 year era for all those bands. The Who had a bad show. Hendrix had a bad show. Janis had a bad show. Almost everyone had a bad show. It was a bad experience on stage for almost everybody. When I was young, I didn't understand that could be possible. Like, what's a bad Jimi Hendrix show? I'll buy tickets for that. And I absolutely would. But compared to their other stuff, when they're in their element and they're indoors with good sound and, a happy audience. It's not angry at everything. And it's a little different story. But them both kind of bailing on her at the last minute probably knocked her on her ass a bit emotionally. And she'd already hung out with the band, during this time, during this little 2-3 days she was there, and gone to, I think they went to a bar together, and they were really happy with what they were doing in the studio. But she had her heart set on this thing happening, and then it didn't happen, and she just called her old dealer and shot up and went downstairs to get change from the fellow at the front desk of the hotel. Bought a pack of Marlboros from the cigarette machine, went back upstairs, passed out, and died. In another parallel to Andrew Wood's death in Seattle, when he overdosed on heroin, 8 other people in the Los Angeles area, very likely people that were the same customers of the same person, died of heroin overdoses that same weekend. The next day, she didn't show up in the studio. Her manager went to the hotel to find her and saw that, after he'd seen that like her car wasn't in the parking lot at the studio and no one had any clue as to what her whereabouts were, went to the front desk asked for a key, went upstairs, opened the door, and found her dead body. It had been laying there for 18 hours, wedged between the bed and the nightstand table next to the bed, where she had landed after she died. Thanks for being here through all this with me. If you want to know more, I obviously highly endorse Alex Eckel's book, Scars of Sweet Paradise. There's a lot more personal stuff there. There's a lot more relationship stuff there and band stuff there. It's not like a biography of Iron Maiden where it's all just tour dates and, you know, how many people were in the venue and what guitars did they play. It's the real deal. It's a great book. As always, I want you to know, and I want myself to know, that rock and roll is, I think, the greatest thing we've got, for as long as we've got it. And it's wonderful. I also want you to know that I think you're wonderful for as long as we've got you. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you were around this long to hear what I put out, and I hope something about this was good for you. Bye, Janice.